Hey, we're back. A little later than what I thought. Done. We'll have some fun today. Yes, 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 yes. Hey, Donald Jones. Yeah, we saw Angie Stone.
Mhm. Well, let me log off.
Okay.
Then I can go listen.
Stay white.
You too.
Bye bye. Hey, how are you, Smith? Reparations Nation. I didn't say anything about Angie Stone. Dewan B did. Um, I'm guilty of not really following. I stopped listening to a lot of music in the 80s. So it's the one B that knows about the music, some of this music. Some of it I don't know. But if it's good music, I heard nothing but good stuff about Angie Stone. Um, I know the older music, I kind of like stopped paying attention. Uh, there you go. Do a little bit more. Yeah. That. So, no, I don't pay attention to that as much. I can't say I know a lot about Kamala, but she was at Howard when we were there. She was there the same time as I, same years. And and a lot of folks were tramps back then. People were hoes back in the 80s. AIDS didn't scare people. They hadn't caught it yet. So, that's how that is. So please share this. We're trying to get back into these books. I love them. Please let people know we back. It's amazing. I miss the COVID era. You used to get audiences better. Now everybody's busy again. Um, that was kind of cold. I don't want people to get sick, but damn, people are more serious because they didn't have as much stupid stuff to do. Um, so we're about to run in a second. So we're going to be live everywhere. Hey, everybody. White evening to you. White evening. White evening. White evening to you. White evening. So, and moderators, shut them up if you need to. Let me put on here. How is everybody? And the temperature's dropping, so I got to put a little bit of warmth on so I can stay awake. Because if it gets cold, it'll knock me out. I am drugged up. I'm fully high naturally, and I may use a little something. I need some performance enhancing drugs. If you like the athletes that get high, you can tolerate me taking some reading enhancing drugs. Sure, you can. It's interesting how hypocritical Black people are. The stars and celebrities can rape people. As long as they have money, they're good. But if you're a broke person, you have to be a saint. When broke Black people ain't saint. I don't know anything about neck bone. Okay, I don't know anything about that. I don't keep up with this stuff. I don't really follow people. I just do what little bit I know how to do. Okay. Hey everyone, how are you? We got a little bit of cleaning up to do here. We started on this book by this feminist. You remember her, Rachel Feinstein, and her book was trying to make the feminists out to be good guys. And you can't do that with me. I can't stand feminists. I hate feminism. It's a great social evil. If you're a feminist, this isn't a channel for you. We're here to promote womanhood, real womanhood, but not false womanhood, which is feminism. In fact, let me record this. Hello, hello, hello. Yes, this is the first day of March 2025, and this is the first Angry Black Men's Book Club book reading for the month of March. In accordance with my wonderful doctor, Dr. Theodore Watkins, who recommended that there's something that you like doing. Part of your recovery from this stupid cancer is doing what you like. I like reading. I like sharing information. I have missed this, as you guys know, like all these different things, about 15 different things nearly killed me in the last couple of years. Censorship, harassment, but I'm still here, so I must be meant to do something. So, let me see. You got to do what you have to do. Oh my God, this person's a joke. All I'm gonna say to you is, when it comes down to Diddy, I won't feel anything until I see the list released. We want a list released on Diddy. I don't care about anything else until a list is released. So yeah, I want to make certain I'm nice and warm, lubricated. It's almost 10:30. I had to talk to one of my favorite lady friends. I really like Mrs. Smith. God, it's a really nice looking, intelligent woman. There's nothing like talking to an intelligent woman. It just makes you feel so good. You're addicted. We ran over. For me, a woman's mind is my headboard. So it's just wonderful talking to her. I'm going to shoot up some ginseng. And I've got some will use a little bit of drugs. Let everybody know we're back. The Angry Black Men's Book Club is back. We're going to read the last chapter of this fake book here by this no good feminist who tried to snow job us. See, no. I can't be fooled by feminists. I came up with them. I hate being lied to. I hate feminist lies. I'm too familiar with them. And there's a glare. I may have to turn one of these lights off because I can't stand glare. So let me see, gotta get this stuff settled. I didn't want it to be too dark. And we've got actually I have two things, and I'm gonna probably do a little bit of both because I don't want to do all of it. This Harriet Jacobs book is extensive. I've got two books to counter this feminist. In fact, let me adjust the light in here because the glare is kicking my eyes in the behind. I don't want to have a glare. So let's see. Let me move my trusty Bible. I love my Bible. I'm going to do something about this light because it's kicking my behind. And I'm going to switch light out. Then I'm going to come right back. And I have two books. I'm going to just mention one. I may just read a little bit. Intro one book, do another one. And everybody let them know. Let me see. Oh, God. God help me. I don't like silly stuff. I'm going to say this once and for all. I never go to anyone's channel and do anything stupid, no matter how goofy I am. I'm a pretty goofy, silly person. I never do it because I think what people do, they take time to do it. So if you go on any of these things, you do something kind of stupid, I may block you from the channel. I have, they're shadow banning me. I have enough people following, so I don't need anyone that's foolish. I don't like fools too much. So let's be straight on that. So if you're a fool, this isn't what we're doing. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm not an entertainer. I don't want to be famous. Okay. So if people ask about the dumb stuff, this isn't what we do. So warning, moderators on all the platforms, everybody, let people know we're talking about feminism, slavery, racism, women. If you're off that topic, you may get timed out or you may be permanently removed from the channel. In fact, that's what I prefer to do, is just completely removed permanently. It's not like that. I mean, I joke with people all the time, but we're going to simply do, I mean, I don't mind goofy, but sometimes, but other times, no. Now it's not goofy. And this is very serious what we're talking about. And you want to go somewhere else, you have nothing better to do with yourself. I mean, if you don't have enough Red Bull and lube to play with yourself somewhere, well, don't play here either. So that's how that goes. Let me adjust this light a little bit. It's too bright for me. And we'll get on with this. And we're going to kick it off again with Feinstein's book. I'm going to mention one book and then I'm going to do another. And we'll see how they do this. So it's real simple. And so if I need moderators on the different channel, I need a moderator. Smith, if you could go over to the Angry Black Men's Book Club and moderate for me, I'd appreciate it. So we can have a whole bunch of things to be normal. We're not going to have foolishness. Okay. And let me adjust the light. And then we're going to be off and running. Oh, this is so much better. Yes. My eyes love it. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. This is so much better. Oh, great. Yes. And I can get a little bit. We don't want to have any surprises. Okay. All right. Let me put my eyes on. It's okay. Hello to you and Coon Buster, all those folks on Twitter. And I can actually put this. I can put it like I don't need any glare. Okay. That's better. Yes. Gotta have my eyes. If my eyes don't work, it's pointless. Okay. Everybody, welcome, welcome, welcome again to the Angry Black Men's Book Club. Just reading. This is just some ginseng. And I'm gonna have some ashwagandha, which is really good. And we'll be off and running. How y'all doing? Okay. Wonderful. Throw some water up behind there. Here we go. Now, we're doing, at least looking at three different books. But the main book tonight is Harriet Jacobs. Her book is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And we'll get into her later. But Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, it's one of these, one of the very first slave narratives written by a woman talking about what she went through. There's another book we may touch through, go through the introduction. And I think we may do a piece of it. This is another book I'm going to be covering in the next day or so. I'm going to be doing Harriet Jacobs and this book, They Were Her Property. They Were Her Property. It's White Women as Slave Owners in the American South by Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. The reason I literally ordered this book, so I always like when people send donations. I have another copy somewhere, I don't know where it is, buried beneath other books. But I was troubled by Miss Feinstein's effort to try to make it seem as if white women who owned, together with their husband, if you consider that women at least owned some of the slave folks, but outright white women owned about 47% of the slaves in the antebellum South. So white feminists are liars. White women need to stop talking bad about white men. White men have done good by white women. White women have been well taken care of by white men. Black men bleed, suffer, and die for rights that white women receive. Black people, black men in particular, die and get beat for it, whether it's affirmative action, all this stuff that's put in our name and it ends up going to white women, gays, or others. So I'm tired of the bullshit and I won't tolerate it anymore. So this is an anti-feminist platform. I hate feminism. Tell everybody, let the word go forth. I'm not going to tolerate it. And it's time that people admit German woman loved Hitler, don't have this thing they're oppressed after the war is over. After the war is over and Hitler's beaten, now all of a sudden, well, women were oppressed in the Third Reich. Bull crap. Women are partners with men in every society. Women are equally culpable for what men do. White women were the main beneficiaries of slavery in America. If they were the mistress in the big house, she was the one that was running the slaves when he wasn't there. When the Civil War came, white women were running the plantations. So don't act like that. So Miss Feinstein is very dishonest. Miss Feinstein is also anti-Christian. And she's pushing a leftist feminist line that's inapplicable to Black people. It's inadmissible to our history. And that's why I mentioned the other night, when she's writing about Harriet Jacobs and all of her agency, all of these people are Christian. There's this big thing among leftist people, in particular, leftist, Marxists, LGBTQ, anarchistic Jews, and others, where they hate Christianity. I mean, hell, what? You wouldn't let us be Jews in your synagogue. We got to have something. You've got a beef with white folk in Europe that you identify as, and then you come and attack Black people clinging to the one thing they can't have is Christianity. And because you had a problem with those very same white people you get nose jobs and everything to look like to belong to, you attack or exclude or decide you're going to remove from our history who we are because of your problem. You know, we're sort of like a cultural West Bank and Gaza. We're just going to bomb and deplete everything and put in what we want. And we have to say no to that. Okay, I don't hate anybody, but damn it. Harriet Jacobs, when I read her book, she's going to talk more about God than anything. She's not talking about agency and resilience. And her mother died when she's 6. Who the hell do you think taught her how to resist all this stuff? Okay, so we got to get this straight. And any Black woman that's calling herself a feminist in 2025 is a stupid ass cunt. Stop it. For women's rights, want decent pay, all that stuff I'm with. But stop running after the ideology of the same white women that looked the other way when you got raped or they beat you or tried to kill you or even murdered your children when you were enslaved. So part of what we're going to do Women's History Month is get some of the clutter out of the brains of our confused Black feminists. They need to quit. And I don't care who doesn't like it. I don't want to work in the university. I don't want to have to pretend, that a man is a woman, a woman's a man, and all this other kind of stuff. We're done with that. With that having been said, again, it's 10:43 p.m., the 1st of March, 2025, and this is the Angry Black Men's Book Club, and we're kicking off Women's History Month with our anti-feminist book series. And this entire month we'll be attacking feminism and white female supremacist bigotry. We don't care who doesn't like it. In fact, send this to a women's studies program. Tell those whores to come and debate us. Stop claiming that you were victims when you're the main beneficiaries of racism in this country. We're tired of it. So again, I'm reading the last part of When Rape Was Legal by Rachel Feinstein, the last chapter, White Women's Role in Sexual Violence Against Enslaved Black Women. And I'm reading it as a gag reel. I'm going to probably read the intro to They Were Her Property by Stephanie Jones Rogers. And then we're going to start off in Harriet Jacobs' book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Y'all got it? Okay. And we're tired of Democrats. And moderator, we don't need anyone to lecture us about religion. The last thing we want is to be lectured about religion from white Americans. You haven't practiced Christianity, the vast majority of you don't know what it is. When you start talking about religion, you throw it out as a means to silence or suppress us. That isn't Christianity, that's witchcraft. So Lisa Moore makes certain that you're not practicing divination and witchcraft. You will not control this discussion. We're not moved by how you feel. And if you're convicted, it's because you're guilty. And if you don't know your background, you don't know whether your family owned, and Moore is a Scottish name. Scottish people are disproportionately represented in the Ku Klux Klan. Check your own family out before you talk to me about what we believe. Let the church say amen. It is now 10:45. I'm now reading the last chapter of Feinstein's When Rape Was Legal. White women's role in sexual violence against enslaved Black women. Quote, her back bore the scars of 1,000 stripes. Not because she was backward in her, not because she was backward in her work, nor because she was unmindful and rebellious in spirit, but because it had fallen to her lot to be the slave of a licentious master and jealous mistress. She shrank before the lustful eye of the one, and was in danger of her life at the hands of the other. Between the two, she was indeed cursed. From Solomon Northrop's book, 12 Years a Slave. It's a quotation used by Miss Feinstein. Let me see. Did I read this last night? Let me make sure that I'm on the right chapter. Okay, no. Okay. Actually, I need to be in the chapter 5. This is the very last one. My bad. Chapter 5. The Power of Language. White women's divorce petitions. In 1806, Mary Jackson, a white woman living in Georgia, petitioned for divorce from her husband Joseph Jackson because of his adultery with the woman he owned as a slave. In her divorce petition, Mary described herself as loyal and obedient to her husband and observant of her role as a married white woman. Like many white women divorcing their husbands for similar reasons, Mary overlooked the violence and rape carried out by her husband against enslaved Black women, and she reinforced the subordinating images of herself as a white woman. The language used in divorce petitions from slavery reflects the white racial framing of white men, white women, and enslaved Black women from this period. Moreover, these petitions shed light on the mutually constructive nature of intersecting institutions of oppression. White women interested in gaining independence and property through a divorce from an abusive or disloyal husband ultimately relied on stereotypes of white women's inferiority and dependence on men. And that's what feminism does to this day, people. White women being inferior instead of being equal partners and players, which they most certainly are, while simultaneously directing attention away from the needs of enslaved Black women who had been sexually violated. While many divorces were granted, the overarching systems of white sexism and systemic gendered racism were reinforced. In her divorce petition, Mary Jackson explained that she lived with said Joseph Jackson, as his lawful wife and performed all the duties incumbent on her by the matrimonial connection. She treated her husband with respect and affection and rendered due obedience to all his commands. Despite her loyalty, Joseph was forgetful of his marriage vow to love and cherish your petition, and hath alienated his affection from your petitioner and attached himself to a Negro woman, the property of the said Joseph. He now lives in habitual indulgence of an illicit and carnal commerce with the said Negro woman, and daily commission of adultery with her. Obedient to her husband and the institution of marriage, Mary represents herself as fulfilling the expectation of white womanhood, including her willful subordination to her husband. Ironically, she does this in order to gain independence from her husband. Divorce petitions like Mary's demonstrates a unique role of white women during slavery and their responses to sexual violence carried out by their husbands against enslaved Black women. From their intersectional location, white women experience incentives to reinforce their own subordination to white men as well as the oppression of enslaved Black women. In this case, Mary's insistence on her obedient character upholds the norms and roles of white femininity that ensure that white women's dependence on men. Additionally, Mary uses the norm of white women as obedient in order to reaffirm the racial boundaries between her and Black women. Reestablishing these boundaries enables her to represent herself as an unthreatening white woman in need of white male assistance, such as that of the judge. In her description of the sex relationship between her husband and the enslaved woman he owned, the euphemistic language Mary uses masks the idea of rape and promotes the idea of a white male entitlement. Euphemisms such as adultery and illicit and adulterous intercourse, commonly used in divorce petitions, can be understood as intersectional tactics or strategies used by white women and men to achieve certain benefits at the expense of reproducing and oppression of other groups. The euphemisms used for rape function to preserve an element of white male virtue and allow white women to be framed as victims as opposed to the Black women who were sexually violated. It is the same way that white women benefit most from DEI, from CRT, from affirmative action, from the EEOC, and everything else, and minority set-asides, all the while being victims and getting the lion's share of stuff that they didn't even fight for. And when these programs, whether it's SNAP, WIC, any of that comes under attack, the face of it are either Black men or Black women that are undeserving, while white women have gotten the lion's share of it. It is obscene, but it is the norm, and that is the passive, microaggressive, socio-political racism of white women. And it's just time for us to deal with this as this is. The word habitual indulgence suggests the frequency with which Joseph engaged in sexual encounters with this enslaved woman, as well as the frame of the act as an excessive luxury. Moreover, according to Mary, Joseph daily commission of the adultery. While this phrase implies the husband's active role in the sexual relationship and an element of authority in the ability to command the adulterous acts, the phrase also avoids any description of violence or the experiences of the enslaved Black woman involved. They don't really care about you, dumb Black woman feminists. You're just really stupid women, and I can't respect it. A Black feminist is always a stupid woman. There's no ifs, buts, and ands about it. Because of the rape of enslaved Black women was not considered illegal during slavery, enslaved Black women did not have access to the court system or legal protection against rape. Therefore, legal documentation that directly involves white men accused of raping or sexually violating enslaved Black women is extremely rare. Instead, petitions for divorce from white women like Mary Jackson, accusing their husbands of sexual relationships with Black women who were enslaved, provide formal legal documentation of these incidences. The language used by white women to describe the enslaved Black women and their husbands' behavior allows for an analysis of intersectionality and the power dynamics between white men, white women, and the enslaved Black women. Of the slaveholding white women who petitioned for divorce, the large number of reports of adultery and illicit connections with enslaved Black women provides an additional indicator of how common the practice of sexually violating enslaved black women was for white men. In total of the 706 petitions submitted by white women attempting to divorce slaveholding white men, 94 petitions discuss white men who are sexually involved with black women. Of these 94, at least 80 involved enslaved black women. Despite the frequency of sexual violence appearing in the divorce petitions, most reasonably, this data significantly underestimates the actual rates of rape, since many groups are not included. For instance, many white women did not divorce their husbands. They were getting paid. They were getting paid. I will read this again. Despite the frequency of sexual violence appearing in divorce petitions, most reasonably this data significantly underestimates the actual rates of rape, since many groups are not included. For instance, many white women did not divorce their husbands. They stayed. They were getting paid. It worked for them. Just like when a woman lets the husband molest the children or the dog, or he watches porno all day, or he's violent towards her, but I'm taken care of. Did not divorce. You enabled it, regardless of the sexual behavior with black women, thus reducing the representation of these petitions to a small segment of white female slaveholding population. Additionally, divorce petitions do not include any incidents of sexual violence or rape by white men against enslaved black women, which white women chose to ignore, deny, or avoid mentioning in a divorce petition. This sample also admits the sexual exploitation of black women perpetrated by unmarried white men. And of course, it's not mentioned the black men who were sexually, and black children sexually exploited by white men, boys and girls. This sample also admits the sexual exploitation of enslaved black women perpetrated by unmarried white men. Remember, early in this book, these boys were encouraged to have sex at an early age. It was universal in the South. Raping black women is as normal to slavery as fried chicken is to the South. However, these accounts do demonstrate the sexual violation of enslaved women by white men was commonplace. It was normal, like police murders are normal, like lynching is normal, like pedophilia is normal. It was wrong. When you own people, you own their breast, their vagina, their rectum, their scrotum. You don't have a right to it. In addition to the regularity with which this sexual exploitation appeared in divorce petitions, the language white women used throughout the petitions to describe their white husband's sexual violence and the enslaved black women involved elucidates the role that white women played in reproducing privilege, power, and subordination. Much like Mary Jackson, Martha A. England, Harvey utilized racialized and gendered framing of white women and reinforced white gender norms in her petition to divorce her husband, Joseph A. Harvey. She submitted the petition to the Noxubee County, Mississippi in 1855, and like most white women petitioning for divorce for similar reasons, Martha failed to acknowledge the sexual violence of force inherent in her husband's behavior. Instead, she relied on the term adultery to describe his actions, which implies consent between her husband and the enslaved black woman, despite the significant disparity of power and rights of each. Moreover, Martha exemplified the practice of using white gender norms to achieve her goal of divorce.
She began her petition by betraying her own innocence and white purity, explaining that she, quote, lived with her husband with all due fidelity towards him and never violated her plighted faith in marriage vow. But your oratrix would state and charge that her said husband, the said defendant, not regarding the sanctity of marriage relations, but in violation of its most sacred duty towards her, and the contraction of that solemn pledge, has committed the crime of adultery with a certain Negro girl, the slave of the said defendant. This may have even been a minor, which means pedophilia doesn't even come up, people. Sometimes these people did have sex with children. It was commonplace. The crime of adultery with a certain Negro girl. Martha juxtaposed her white feminine virtue with her husband's sinful, adulterous behavior in order to support her petition, framing herself as loyal to her husband and to the sacred institution of marriage. Martha depicted an image of herself that was consistent with the ideal white womanhood, reflecting intersectional incentives in white femininity. Martha exploits her white femininity at the expense of reinforcing white sexism in order to achieve her divorce, demonstrating the way in which institutions of oppression reinforce themselves. In contrast to the positive depiction of herself, she frames her husband as someone who took advantage of her loyalty and her innocence by violating his duty towards her. In this way, she suggests that he failed to live up to the expectations of white masculinity, including white male virtue and protection of white women. Martha's petition to divorce was granted. Carolyn Dugan, who petitioned for divorce from Jacob Dugan in Claiborne County, Mississippi in 1858, provides another example of a white woman overlooking the sexual violence of her husband. Carolyn explained that her husband committed the crime of adultery with a certain Negro slave, and for the last year has lived openly and notoriously in adultery with the said Negro slave, with whom he has constantly committed and still does daily commit the crime of adultery. This passage indicates the only crime committed by Jacob Dugan was adultery, even when attempting to negatively portray their white husbands as sinful, abusive, or in some cases drunk, in order to defend their desire to divorce. White women like Carolyn Dugan often failed to see and describe the adulterous relationship with the enslaved woman was a form of violence and cruelty perpetrated by their husbands. The force and coercion and abuse that went into the sexual encounters between white men and enslaved black women, as well as the purchasing of enslaved women solely for sexual purposes, could all be used to challenge the reputations of these white men. However, the absence of this discussion in such petitions evidences the way in which these sexual relationships were framed during the period. Generally, white people did not perceive sex between white men and enslaved black women as a problem of coercion or rape. The force and threats used by white men to engage in sexual relationships were considered appropriate by the white general public. That's white men and white women felt raping and taking black women and children was appropriate. Feminists lie. And if women owned almost half of the slaves in this country, then it meant women had a say over whether these women would be raped or not. If they allowed it to happen, it meant they were good with it. Again, white men to engage in these sexual relationships were considered appropriate by the general white public, since most whites believed in the legitimacy of white entitlement to property rights over enslaved people. Your property includes your vagina, your breast, your womb, your scrotum, your penis, your whatever, your children. their orifices, their mouths, you name it. Slavery was always a nasty, freaky, deaky thing. Always. A disproportionate number of people that were enslaved in the antebellum South were children. Black children were raped, molested, abused, branded, sometimes tortured and killed for the sole benefit of the pleasure of white owners. White women and white men had no problem with it. They were property. They were subhuman. They were not people. How can women recast themselves? A few decades later in the 1950s, as feminists, as victims, when they were people and Black women were property, and they're your sisters now. White men could use force and sexual abuse towards enslaved Black women, and white women would read this behavior as adultery instead of sexual violence. The same thing happens with Black kids raped in foster care all over this country as I presently speak. The same way social workers and other people don't see this, the same way Black kids are mass raped in public education, and so forth and so forth and so forth. You can't respect a Black feminist when you know the history. It's just, they have no grounds to stand on. They really need to just shut up and go somewhere. This section, white women as victims. Imagine that. They're the victims. The only crime committed by white men was adultery. White women as their wives became the sole victims. In the divorce petitions, white women repeatedly framed themselves as victims of abuses carried out by white men, including of the sexual violation perpetrated against a Black woman. In other words, they get to be minorities and white at the same time, getting equity out of white womanhood and out of the oppressed caste, just like right now with DEI, affirmative action, and everything else. And I'm sorry, you Black women, let them do it. Look at how loyal white women are to white men, and look at how disloyal Black feminists are to Black men. That's a continuation of the slave regime. Even though your ass went to Rutgers or Radcliffe or Bryn Mawr or Smith College or some other place where you wear the thick bottom shoes and the ugly glasses and other stupid behavior of these masculine looking thugs out here that call themselves Black women's leadership. Hoes need to sit down and shut up. Again, repeatedly frame themselves as the victims of abuses carried out by white men, including the sexual violation perpetrated against enslaved Black women. They got your equity too. Black women were merely described as tools of abuse used by the perpetrator white men against white women. In addition to the examples of Mary Jackson, Martha Harvey, and Carolyn Duggan, who described their husbands as violating their marital duties by committing adultery, Lucy Burwell exemplifies the way in which white women portrayed themselves as the sole victims of their husband's actions. Lucy Burwell requested a divorce from her husband, John, as well as a portion of his estate. Listen to this, which included approximately 30 or more enslaved men and women. Her reason for the divorce were multiple, including John's physically abusive behavior towards her and his adultery with an enslaved woman. Interestingly, Lucy described the violent physical she experienced as by no means the greatest evil John carried out against her. Instead, she found his adultery to be a particular insult and humiliation. So in other words, you can beat my behind, but don't screw the Black bitch. That's the real thing. In other words, I hate them more than I hate me being beaten. She states that John engaged in disreputable intimacy with one of his own female slaves. He has, quote, he has become the indulgence of this illicit and adulterous intercourse. that the actual presence of his wife and children has been insufficient to control him, close quote. On one particular occasion, John announced in the presence of his children, quote, that he would not share her bed that night, but would occupy a different room with the female slave aforesaid, who remained in the room with him during the night, close quotes. Lucy was convinced that John fathered 2 children by this enslaved woman. The petition concludes, consequences of this degrading connection, her said husband, has ceased to treat her with affection, and your oratrix no longer feels herself safe in his house. So she's getting her behind beat, and she ain't getting no dick either. And it's the black woman who's the slave's fault. And she should get half. My God. White women constructed a narrative in divorce petitions which emphasized their role as the victim. Adultery and humiliation for these white women overshadowed the rape and the abuse experienced by enslaved black women. Notice she keeps saying black women. I need to say black women and girls. Little girls getting raped by a grown white man, and she's angry with the little girl. What's the little girl gonna do? See how cold these people are? See how mean they are? By framing the narrative in this way, white women benefited from the court system, responding to their needs while allowing violence against enslaved black females to persist. From their intersectional vocations, white women had the ability to construct narratives in their own interests. In other words, they had a white female supremacist perspective. And there was no unity between women like there isn't now. And the only people that believe in that stuff, again, are dumbass black feminists. Dumb. However, they relied on stereotypes of white, feminine vulnerability in order to emphasize their legal needs for protection. In the process, these narratives also perpetuated the devaluation of black people's lives by dismissing enslaved black females' experiences. Now, I want to say something because this chapter is almost over. Notice that this feminist didn't look for any cases where white women had beaten or killed black women or girls or children. And such information exists. I know of one case in New Orleans, meaning, look at how she made it seem as if white women's only problems with what white men are doing, not about white women killing, beating, aborting, torturing black men, women, children. Indeed, white women nearly exploited sexual violence against enslaved black women in order to craft the image of themselves as victims of adultery. And thus achieve their goals of divorce. The construction of these narratives reflect the intricate way in which the institutions of oppression reinforce one another. The combination of power and constraints experienced by the intermediate group like white women created a context in which white women were incentivized to exploit the violence against enslaved black women for their own benefits. Pleasing the white male-dominated court system required adhering to the norms of white feminine vulnerability and dependence, and the white racial framing of blacks, including the devaluation of their lives and experiences with violence. Moreover, framing their white husbands due to adultery as opposed to rape of enslaved black women avoided the possibility of threatening white entitlement to enslaved property, generally of any individual elite white man working in the court system who might have been involved in similar sexual practices. So, of course, you didn't want to create a legal statute because that was so commonplace. You're not going to call it rape because you're looking to people.
You're looking to people who are doing it to help you, meaning that everybody knows what's going on. Overshadowing the rape that enslaved Black women were experiencing was not the only damaging narrative in these petitions. Many white women also negatively portrayed Black women involved, reinforcing degrading stereotypes of promiscuity and hypersexuality. The language in divorce petitions upheld stereotypes regarding Black women's sexuality and instilled the notion of rape was consensual. Using terms like wench and mulatto throughout the divorce petitions, white women emphasized the dehumanizing and sexually degrading framing employed against enslaved Black women. For example, in 1841, Margaret Garner submitted a divorce petition in Mobile, Alabama, which included degrading terminology for Black women as well as euphemism for her husband's sexual behavior. In addition, this petition reflects Garner's adherence to subordinating white gender norms in order to obtain a divorce. The petition states that Margaret had evidence that her husband had taken a mulatress to the bed of your oratrix and had carnally known the said mulatress. Your oratrix calmly remonstrated with the said Thomas Garner. Although the language holds the husband responsible as an actor in the sexual encounter, the phrases like taking a mulatress to bed and carnally known significantly softens the notions of violation and coercion against a woman whom he raped. Moreover, the term mulatress reflects the derogatory, dehumanizing white racial framing employed by whites. This term may have been used in the divorce petitions in an attempt to emphasize the unacceptable behavior of her husband. Furthermore, Margaret Garner's description of herself as calmly remonstrating with her husband reflects her interest in obeying white gender norms to satisfy the courts and achieve the divorce she desires. While she may succeed in achieving independence from her husband, she has done so at the expense of reinforcing white sexism broadly. Like Margaret Garner, Lerona Foster petitioned for divorce from her husband, Robert Foster, in 1858 Mississippi due to adultery. The term adultery again denies the rape that necessarily occurred in order for her husband, a white male, to have an adulterous relationship with his own enslaved Black woman. Moreover, Lerona's divorce petition dehumanizes Jenny, the enslaved woman involved, and implies a passive role on the part of her husband. The language in the divorce petition reflects the tactics used by Lerona to capitalize on her incentives in whiteness, including achieving a divorce as well as the assets she requested, totaling $21,500, half of Robert's property value. In her petition, Lerona Foster states her reasons for divorce, explaining, Robert has fallen into the arms of adultery with his own slave mulatto woman named Jenny, and others which he lives in breach of his marriage. The term mulatto, frequently used in divorce petitions, reflects enslaved Black women's subhuman status in the eyes of whites. Moreover, the phrase fallen into the arms suggests the passive role of Robert in adultery, as opposed to the recognition of his role in sexual violence. Other petitions implicate enslaved Black women by using the term wench to emphasize their sexuality and promiscuity. For example, in 1848, Montgomery, Alabama, Susan Mary Cox Ray, a white woman, responded to her husband Allen Ray's divorce suit, explaining that he had started a promiscuous illicit intercourse with his own Negro wenches and continued so long as the complainant and defendant resided together, save for the space of 14 years. The description of the petition continues. Albert had, in fact, a special relationship with a female slave named Mary, a seamstress who Susan claims bore him 4 mulatto children. The petition documents deflecting the term wench, used at times by whites like Susan
to negatively frame enslaved women coerced by her husband. The term, which can be associated with wanton women and promiscuity, blames the victim for sexual violence rather than holding the white man accountable for his behavior. Winch creates and perpetuates a stereotype of Black women as promiscuous, legitimizing rape and sexual coercion against them by denying the possibility of their sexual victimization. Throughout such divorce petitions, white women framed enslaved Black women who were the victims of their husband's sexual coercion and violence as wenches and mulattoes, and frequently described the sexual encounters as consensual adulterous relationships, framing enslaved Black women as responsible actors in adultery, further enabling white women to portray themselves as the sole victims of these incidents. As a result, the problem of raping enslaved Black women and the legal needs of these women were overlooked. Instead, the stereotypes and white racial framing of Black womanhood, including sexual promiscuity, were reproduced. The role in which white women and the deflecting language that they use to discuss the rape of enslaved Black women reflects the mechanisms at work within the matrix of domination. During slavery, white women whose husbands engaged in sexual violence against enslaved Black women experienced several intersectional incentives to frame themselves as innocent and dependent victims, to deny their white male husband's cruelty, and to blame enslaved Black women for their own rapes. The linguistic tactics of these white women petitioning for divorce allowed the extreme oppression and sexual violation of enslaved Black women to continue, while also reinforcing white sexism and failing to undermine the virtue status of white men. Conclusion. In addition to the euphemisms which framed white men's adulterers as opposed to rapists, Black women as wanton, many white women used the language in divorce petitions that framed them as meeting the ideal standards of white womanhood, such as Martha Harvey's fidelity, Mary Johnson's due obedience to their husbands, a submissive, calm, and loyal portrayals of themselves, assisted white women to gain divorces from their husbands as well as a portion of the economic resources in many cases. However, the consequences of this framing for white women was a reinforcement of white feminine gender roles and white sexism that is associated. When white women beef about their oppression and how they don't get stuff, they help perpetuate it, not Black men, okay, and not Black women. White women reinforce their own subordination, but feminism blames Black men as co-equal to white men and subordinating white women, and Black men subordinating the Black women that their husbands, sons, and neighbors raped. That's some psychotic, this is some psychopathy with these feminist hoes. It's incredible. The men that couldn't do anything to check these guys are co-equal in guilt to the men that committed the rapes. Within the intersectional system of oppression, white women were located in a space that encouraged them to reproduce their own subordination as well as the oppression of enslaved Black women, ultimately reinforcing the interlocking systems of racism and sexism, reflecting the mutually constructive nature of these institutions of oppression. White women demonstrated their agency within this constraining system of gendered racism. Unfortunately, in many divorce petitions, the agency of white women became entangled in the reinforcement of their own subservience as well as the continued oppression of enslaved Black women. Relying on subordinating representations, white women perpetuated a white sexism in order to achieve certain benefits, such as safety from an abusive husband and economic resources. The intersectional hierarchy locates the group in ways that each experiences various degrees of power and constraints. From this context, intermediate groups like white women experience intersectional incentives. In other words, they get a payoff, folks, and white femininity to overlook the comprehensive role of white men in oppression. Fully acknowledging and resisting white men's roles in oppression would have been potentially threaten the benefits of whiteness that they share. I don't care about justice. I don't care about womanhood. I don't care about women's rights or fairness. I want my white woman MFM, and I don't care who my husband rips, who he screws, who he sells off, who he beats. I just want mine. That's the same way that feminists are right now. And they don't care about Black women. However, failing to recognize and address the responsibility of white men results in the reproduction of their own limited status as white women and the oppressed status of Black women. The concept of intersectional incentives allows for a perspective which combines the structure and individual action by viewing the constant production and reproduction of institutions of oppression as occurring through the process of individual decision-making, such as language used in divorce petitions, which is influenced and motivated by incentives, tactics, and consequences particular to each intersectional location, revealing the interrelatedness between the incentives and the reproduction of oppression, reframes the potential incentives associated with whiteness and white femininity as far less valuable than the incentive to end oppression overall. In other words, it's better to get everything you can get as a white woman than to be for what's right, which is how any Black woman that's hooked up with feminism is a moron. Feminism is for morons. Only Black feminists are stupid. I'm on the last portion. We're almost done with this book, guys. Of course, this book is When Rape Was Legal, Chapter 6, Racialized and Gendered Sexual Violence Today. Quote, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations, and it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. This is a quote from James Baldwin. In 2015, a young white man was found sexually assaulting an unconscious woman near a fraternity house. His arrest that morning and later found guilty of 3 felonies pertaining to sexual assault. The white man was a member of a swim team at an elite university at the time of the offense. He was sentenced to 6 months in jail, of which he served 3 and 3 years of probation. When the judge delivered his strikingly lenient sentence, he justified this by describing the severe impact that prison might have on this young man with no prior record. Several similar cases permeate the news today, reporting on young white college men who've evaded severe prison sentences despite their acts of sexual assault and rape. In many cases, the protection of these men's reputations and future opportunities is described as the reason for the lack of serious punishment. For elite white men, particularly those in college or with bright futures ahead of them, the court overlooks the depths of the violence in their acts of rape and sexual assault. In delivering life sentences, the United States court system continues to confirm the entitlement of white men to sexual assault and rape. Although the legal system has evolved over time, legacies from slavery persist, including white male entitlement to rape, thus failing to address the need of rape victims and degrading women of color through the use of white racial frame. Let me add that the courts also don't punish white women that have molested children in schools across this country. In fact, they're often celebrated. She only deals with white men. Everybody's in on this. This is not some unique thing to one sex or the other. Racism is a mom and pop sport. Stop blaming white men. Everyone's doing it. Because rape of enslaved Black women was legal during the antebellum period, white men had the ability to use this form of violence to achieve dimensions of white masculinity that were valued. This practice of exploiting sexuality of vulnerable or subordinate women in order to fulfill expectations of masculinity continues to this day. The white racial framing that whites developed during slavery to maintain the positive image of themselves amid rampant sexual violence they carried out is also evident in present-day interviews with white American men. Moreover, recent research reflects that white women's continued inaction in response to sexual victimization of Black women and their adherence to the white racial framing of Black women as hypersexual. Contemporary research demonstrates that racial and gendered violence embedded in U.S. history lives on in modified ways, and not so. The United States military, of the 20,000 or so Black women, not Black women, but American women that get raped in the military, when I last checked, about a third of the women in the United States military are Black, meaning that Black women are disproportionately represented as the victims of rape within the United States military. Black women are raped in prisons and in other institutions consistently. Too often by Black men, but often by white men. Black women to this day are disproportionately represented and the people trafficked. This is just a fact. There are tens of thousands of missing Black women, some of them certainly victimized by all types of men. Let me keep going. And to the person, even if you're not participating historically, let's just be straight. The house that I'm sitting in the title deed, this house was not to be sold to Black people. If you're a white woman, even if you didn't do anything, you benefited. When this house was initially built, no matter if we were multimillionaires, we couldn't have lived here because of what we look like. Because of slavery, racism, and discrimination, you could have bought the house. You're a beneficiary of a caste system. You are collectively guilty the same way we collectively get discriminated against. White people need to grow the fuck up. We get screwed. Racial profiling, they profile all of us. And somebody think that if I'm not doing anything, yet this evil's going on, I've done nothing to stop it, and I'm not actively against it, I'm somehow not stained by it. That's insane. When I got harassed in the hospital last month because someone white decided to accuse me on site of stealing their iPad without them even being around, they collectively blamed me without any evidence. That is life for us. Part of the fact that the white majority of people in this country have refused to take a stand to be for fairness for everyone, you're all collectively guilty. The same way when O.J. Simpson is alleged to have killed Nicole Simpson, we collectively pay for it. One Black person accused of doing a crime means all of us pay for it. White people as a majority participate in the oppression of other people, and we're supposed to cherry pick the guilty people. That's part of white privilege. I'm not accountable for what my group does. If my group collectively hurts people, I'm different. Germans that did not support Hitler, that were not Nazis, still were impacted when Bomber Fritz and these other people bombed Germany. German people who were not Nazis, but they were part of the society that went to war with France and England and Russia. They got hell just like the rabid Nazis did. White Americans need to understand part of white privilege is that people have to cherry pick how you're looked at. When Black people go through, we don't get cherry picked. We collectively, when we denied credit and everything else, we collectively get screwed. And that means there's a collectivity of oppression that white people participate in, including white women. Everybody's guilty until the system changes. You're not changing the system, you're part of the problem. Sorry. black person, do everything, go to the hospital, got insurance, and white folks do what, this medical apartheid, and they kill people. Tens of thousands of black people die every year. I didn't do it, but the system that you don't fight did it. The system that benefits you did it. You're not saying no to it. I'm vocally against violence against women. I don't care who I offend. I don't like violence and abuse of women. I'm loud about it. Too many men do it. Because men can do certain things doesn't mean, even though I don't do it, doesn't mean I should be silent. The gays say silence is consent. White folks consent to black oppression. White folks sat back and let 15 million illegals come in this country. And they watched black folks, communities and everything, schools be taken, and no one said anything. You didn't say anything. I bet you didn't. You're guilty. I don't like what happens to people being oppressed anywhere, so I've raised my voice when I can. Most white folks sit on the sidelines and act like it has nothing to do with them. When white folks got the GI Bill, and when black folks couldn't get the GI Bill, and black folks were forced into slums, there was no mass protest of white people. White folks didn't care. White folks didn't care about it. And they sat back, they don't see it. 1 in 9 black kids ripped out of black households. You'll never see any critical mass of white people saying, stop this. Not even the abolitionist movements, less than 0.5% of white folks. With black folks being raped, gibbeted, killed, sold, drowned, fed to alligators, most white people. Then when we talk about the problem, not me. So when a white person says I didn't participate, it's like a German saying we didn't know the Holocaust was going on. Damn it, you damn sure know what happened. And it's a study in white cognitive dissonance and dishonesty that there are 50, 60 million black people in this country and you don't know a damn thing about what happened. How do you not know? That's a decision not to know. Most white people in America have no black friends, with millions of us floating around. Not one decent rapport with anyone black. That is a way of life, hatred, exclusion, alienation, and denial. And then when someone says something that makes you feel uncomfortable, not me, bullshit. 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 When white folk get mad about something, things change. White people are comfortable with mass incarceration. White people are comfortable with gentrification. White folks are great with black people being replaced by illegals. You're all guilty. The same way black people collectively suffer, we die earlier because of where we are. Someone is benefiting from what happens. This Narcan that I got on the floor here, for years they let black folks die for narcotics brought in this country, for white supremacy, for the CIA to fund its blood. They put dope that's killed maybe millions of black people. When whites began to have problems, all of a sudden they started handing this stuff out to save white life. Where were the white people to cry out? In fact, when crack came along, they made the image of crack addicts, even though whites use 80% of it, the image of crack was black. Now that fentanyl has killed well over 1 million people, because it's white people dying, there's no face of fentanyl to defend white drug addiction, white folks with no self-control, with no values, with no God, with no decency, who can't control themselves. And part of why you can't get this fentanyl issue solved is that typically you have to have something to rally around to either fight or save, because white people can't be addicted to drugs no matter how many die. And because it's white folks, now there's treatment, there's all kinds of care, there's drug court,
everything. When black kids were dying and overdosing, nobody cared. No, I mean, people could get any help, lock them up, kill them, jail them. That's part of who you are. You are not outside the society in which you live. I'm not outside. So like I said, every house I've lived in DC, in the title, I wasn't supposed to live there based on how I look. It meant you could live there. Things were structured to favor you and punish me whether I could afford it or not. That's why we're reading this book. And yes, you should feel guilty. This thing is horrible. The high blood pressure, the fact that they poison the chicken in this country and it's killing. Even me, I got to stop eating chicken. Food that we eat, they targeted. So we die. Renal failure, cancer, and no one talks about it. I'm being murdered because of what I look like. And they're white scientists and doctors, even the white doctors I go to see, I have renal failure and they don't even tell me or explain what the stats say. Thank God I went to see a black doctor for a second opinion. So the nice white doctor is letting me die, even though he's getting paid and I'm doing that. That's my reality, white woman. And you guys know this. Sure you do. Never come on my platform and think I won't be honest about this. They've shut down the black hospitals, closed down the black medical schools so we can't be healthy. Food deserts, you shut down black farmers, can't feed, and then talk about how bad we are. Someone's benefiting. All of this is being done to tell you that you're better than me. And that you wouldn't do it because you're virtuous. And I'm just bad black with a chip on my shoulder. I'm just full of bigotry and hatred for people, which ain't so. But we got to call it what it is. And if you have a hard time hearing it, damn it, you've never lived a minute of this. You've never had to wonder each time you leave your house, if you see a police car, are they going to like shoot or kill me because I'm black? And of course, I'll get dragged in the news and they'll find something. Y'all don't live with that. You don't live when you do a job interview and it's a nice white woman HR person and they're looking for the crime you committed. There's even a break of a month or so when you work, deny you employment. You've never lived that. And they're always nice people. The Gestapo, most Gestapos were bureaucrats. Everybody wasn't beating Jews and others in trenches. These are nice people with jobs. People that know that fluoride kills black people and they put in the water. People that knew that this COVID virus killed certain people more than others. When someone like Mr. Kennedy tries to talk about it, they accuse him of being a racist. Who's sitting up creating biological weapons to kill whole groups of people? They're not black. They look like you. Because you've stolen people's land and resources. It's been good to you. However, part of the breaks is that people start looking and noticing, why is Africa rich as a continent and its people poor? Why is Angie Stone dead right after she says, Universal Music, I've made great music, you've made millions, how come I can't have any? And now she's dead. When people say, may I have some of what I earn, I get killed, I get destroyed. There's sexual predators and folk all over the country. It's only when Diddy, who I can't stand, went after the people that were making the Chirac that all this stuff happened. You're comfortable with social evil being done to black people. And nobody's taking the time. One, I don't want to sleep with you. A white woman molested my brother and was trying to molest me. So I'm not crazed about hooking up with the white woman, so I can talk to you like a human being. I don't need to live next door to you. I don't want to marry you. I don't want to hurt you, but I'm not going to lie or deny or make it soft for you. When the people accused me of stealing their iPad at Sibley Hospital and insulted and embarrassed me, and I'm there trying to make certain my mother who has cancer gets health care, they never apologized. Y'all have never acknowledged what you've done to people, not just here. Vietnam, I mean, you guys have blood-stained hands globally. And y'all have never been dogged for what you've done. I mean, even them hearing a little bit, not me, yeah, damn it, it's you. And white women in particular, you've been the biggest beneficiaries of white men are killing and doing this to other people to give you a better life than other women. That's what this book is about. Absolutely, it's you. Let me finish this book. But we got to have this damn conversation. And white feminists oppose black men voting. White feminists wouldn't even work with black women to get the right to vote. White feminists have supported eugenics for black people to be wiped out. Margaret Sanger and others. White women have been part of this. Get out of here with not me. If it ain't you, it's somebody you know. Your mama. If you're living on something, if you got any kind of white middle class stuff out of the GI Bill, when white folks got basically 10 times what black people got, and nobody said, hey, the black guys that died, in fact, it's 80 years since D-Day, and we don't see images of black men who got mowed down. It's only the heroic white men. The black men that got mowed down, we still aren't allowed to see that black men bled for America. We get a new administration, and the first thing I want to do is act as if talking about the Tuskegee Airmen is racism against white people. You guys are fucking psychotic and out of control. And it's not us. I don't got any guns. I'm not planning to do anything. But you got a world waking up to your asses. And some of them are developing nukes, already have them. And you know what? Nobody wants to go into the army. They're going to try to do this draft thing. So now all of a sudden, the same people that you've dogged, lynched, are going to be called to fight for a society that doesn't even allow them to belong where they've been for thousands of years to make you feel secure. Get the hell out of here. Let me finish. The legacies from slavery. The white racial framing that white men constructed during slavery to justify their rape of enslaved black women is evident in the stereotypes, narratives, and sexual fantasies of white men today. In a 2014 study using in-depth online questionnaires found that white American men between the ages of 18 and 60 years continue to view black women as in sexually degrading ways that rely on deep intersectional framing. Mirroring slavery, these men view white feminine features as the standard for attractiveness, deeming beautiful only those mixed-race black women who approximated white femininity. Moreover, whites' perception of black women reflect a similar complexity in the framing used during slavery, wherein white men were simultaneously viewed black women as inferior and sexually appealing. Many white men today describe black women as unattractive while at the same time sexualizing them, including having sexual fantasies about black women. In several cases, white men described having former relationships with black women primarily for sexual reasons and explained that they could not envision having meaningful long-term relationships with these women. Sexual experience and deviance were racialized onto the bodies of black women during slavery, and this framing continues. Many white men view sexual experiences with black women as an opportunity to move beyond their normal. In other words, black women are beasts. And white women are cool with that because white women have the same bestial fantasies about black men. And they're more interested, they're size hoes. Who has the biggest penis? Black men have no value as human beings. Almost all of you are guilty. Any black man that goes online has to fight off legions of immoral white women. If I told you how many I blocked in Facebook, if I said 5,000 or 6,000, that would be an underestimate. I don't hurt anybody. I don't want to harm anyone. I do not disrespect white women as people. I'm only saying that the reputation of white women is that they're gin and tonic freaks. I don't believe that. I won't live that. That's just an observation. Okay? And the face of porn ain't a black woman. Take that as you'd like. So they move beyond their normal sexual activity to experience the other side of sexuality. In other words, black people are beasts, black women are beasts. And that continues with white men that could sell off their own children as pickaninnies, as burrheads. It's their semen, and they see because it's with the black woman, it's not human. All of you guys are guilty of it. All. If that were not the case, there wouldn't be a status of white in this country. It benefits somebody. In this sense, white men are using multiple elements of the white racial frame, which depict black women and men as more primitive and sexualized. He just said white men, white women too, broad. The framing of black women as exotic allows white men to experience sexual attraction and use sexuality to degrade black women, while reiterating their identity as marginal and outside the normal standards of behavior and beauty. This is inclusive of the white LGBTQ folks too. I just went there. In turn, white men's sexual fantasies and behavior involving black women do not threaten the racial hierarchy and framing of white women and men as superior to the sexualized black women. Moreover, as Bell Hooks explains, the black female body in the U.S. history has always served as a site for the construction of white sexual standards used as a reference point. Although recorded rates of interracial rape are very low today, women of all races continue to be subjected to male violence at alarming rates, and black women experience higher rates of violent victimization than most. Violent victimization for black women in 2015 were 24 per thousand compared to the national rate of 18.6 per thousand. In 2014, the rate of rape and sexual assault victimization for black women was 3 per thousand compared to 1.8 per thousand for white women. However, relying on official police statistics of a national crime victimization survey presents a challenge to obtaining accurate rates of violent crimes like rape and sexual assault. Many women and men do not report their experience of sexual victimization to the police or to survey researchers. The sensitive nature of rape victimization and the distinction between personal and researcher definitions of what constitutes an act of rape, as well as the potential shame or humiliation that might be experienced when working with the criminal justice system as a victim, prevent many people from sharing this information with others. For these and other reasons, it is widely recognized that the official statistics tend to underreport the rate of sexual violence and rape, particularly for women of color. Because of the methodological challenges posed by studying the rates of rape and sexual assault victimization, alternative research designs may offer greater insight into the present-day experiences of Black women. Additionally, violent victimization rates vary according to the location and socioeconomic status, reflecting the importance of exploring beyond the generalized statistics. For instance, a sample of youth living in one urban setting, Jody Miller found that 89% of Black women had experienced sexual or gender harassment. Over 50% of these women explained that they experienced this harassment in their neighborhoods by adolescent peers or older men. A lot of Black men are pedophiles, folks. Black women, particularly those who are disadvantaged in terms of socioeconomics
or sexual orientation are especially vulnerable to male violence and a lack of protection from the legal system. But I want to say a lot of Black women that are lesbians get their asses beat by women. Anti-violence agencies and the legal system continue to ignore the needs of these marginalized women, instead focusing their attention on criminalization and harsher punishments for offenders, which has disproportionately benefited white women and harmed Black women. During this era of mass incarceration and tough on crime policies, many Black women who are victims of rape and domestic violence continue to be criminalized and framed as prostitutes or violent offenders due to their acts of self-defense or sexual victimization. Failing to understand the broader social context, which increases the vulnerability of marginalized Black women to male violence, allows the court system, anti-violence agencies, the media, and the general public to blame Black women for their own victimization. In one study, Black girls who witnessed domestic violence against women observed a lack of police or public response, reported internalizing messages regarding a lack of resources, assistance in these situations. Moreover, these girls felt that they should blame themselves if they became victims of rape or abuse. Blaming the victims of sexual violence is nothing new. Moreover, Black women have been criminalized for defending themselves against violence and rape since slavery. From the 1800s onward, Black women were sentenced to death by the United States court system for defending themselves against violent abuse, including rape carried out by white men. Sexual crimes committed by white men against Black women were dismissed entirely during slavery, in part because rape was not legally considered a crime, and also because judges framed Black women as sexually promiscuous and therefore unable to be raped. During segregation, the same white racial framing was employed to claim that Black women were prostitutes, promiscuous, and thereby could not be raped by white men whom they charged in court. Today, Black women continue to be framed using similar sexually degrading stereotypes. The white racial framing of Black women as sexually promiscuous is used in an attempt to justify their rape during slavery, and today continues to benefit whites. When Black women were framed as sexually deviant, the framing of white women as sexually pure and moral is reiterated. As a whole, the racialized and gendered framing of Black and white women helps to sustain the divide between the two and justify inequality. The historical context in which racialized gendered ideologies around Blacks and whites emerged and was reinforced is essential for the understanding of the dynamic that led to the sexual violence against women of color today and continued lack of legal protection afforded to these women. In addition to the continued failure of the court system to protect Black women from sexual violence, today we see a continuation of masculinity's dependence on sexual violence for some men. While masculinity can be performed in a myriad of ways depending on one's social class, race, ethnicity, and access to various resources, among other things, some men continue to use violence, particularly sexual violence, as a way to achieve masculinity. For instance, male bonding is carried out through the gang rape of young women at some fraternity parties on college campuses in the United States today. I'm a witness. Members of these fraternities use discourse that encourages and normalizes rape. Successfully violating a young woman while she's heavily intoxicated is reportedly the equivalent to achieving masculinity for many of these men. Moreover, gang raping young women at these parties was found to be part of male bonding, the male bonding experience that was normalized within the setting. Beyond college fraternities, recent research has found that some men living in urban neighborhoods have learned to perform masculinity through the sexual harassment and gang raping of Black women. Sexual harassment and coercion of young Black women was described by these young men as a way to get an image, a name for themselves among their male peers. That's kind of gay. I rape a woman so guys will like me. Moreover, Several young men viewed gang raping black women as a way to bond with other males and transition into young male adulthood, while white men during slavery used rape of enslaved black women in order to lose their virginities. Young men in the modern era have described gang raping young black women in their communities as a coming of age experience. Male bonding through sexual violence can be traced back at least to slavery, as evidenced by the interviews with Sam and Louisa Everett, in which they described their master, Big Jim McLean, entertaining friends by inviting them to engage in orgies with the enslaved women he owned. Sexual violence has been available as a means to achieving masculinity for centuries, particularly for white men. And continues as a practice of masculinity among some men of various races today. The Greek letter societies, people, athletes, I've seen it. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. Parallels in sexual violence of black women during slavery in the modern era suggest the continuing importance of gender norms for incentivizing rape and sexual violence, in addition to the legal context that too often fails to criminalize rape. We're almost done. In addition to the role of white men in the court system in sexual violence, white women continue to play an interesting intermediate role. During slavery, white women experienced some power combined with many constraints. They often find themselves in a position to uphold the rights and entitlement of white men while reproducing the oppression of enslaved black women in their own subordination of the white sexism. Today, research on white women's perception of rape victims reflects a continuation of the white racial framing used during slavery. Moreover, white women's role in supporting oppression of women of color and white male entitlement can be traced from historical documents through contemporary research. In a recent study, white women attending college were asked to describe their intent to respond to a scenario involving an intoxicated woman being brought back into a private room at a party. When the intoxicated woman had a black-sounding name, the white women were significantly less likely to report that they would intervene in a situation or to feel a sense of responsibility for intervening compared to when the intoxicated woman had a non-distinct name. Like white women who ignored and overlooked rape of enslaved black women carried out by their husbands and sons, white women today fail to see their role in addressing the threat of sexual assault for black women. The inability to relate to the experience of sexual violence simply because of racial distinction emphasizes the impact of intersecting oppressions which divide groups like women based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and other characteristics. These divisions imply distinctions in power, privilege, forms of oppression, and a sense of responsibility to intervene on another group's behalf. In this sense, these distinctions play an important role in maintaining oppression. Today, white women are more likely to perceive black women as experiencing pleasure from sexual assault than when a hypothetical victim's race is not indicated. Relying on white racial framing of black women as sexually promiscuous and unable to be raped, dangerous stereotypes persist in ways that help white women to justify their inaction in incidents involving sexual assault. The stereotype of black women's hypersexuality, historically and today, allows white women to discount rape and blame the victims of sexual violence. In another study, priming women's sense of powerlessness or the lack of the ability to influence others increased the likelihood that they would blame the victim of sexual assault. Occupying an intermediate status in which one has limited power incentivizes people to blame the victims of sexual assault in order to distance and distinguish themselves as superior to the victim. During slavery, white women were able to differentiate themselves from enslaved black women by using their limited power and status to punish the enslaved women who were sexually victimized by their husbands. Despite the very limited authority as women, the incentive in holding a small degree of power encouraged white women to overlook commonalities they may have shared with enslaved black women, such as common experiences of domination at the hands of white men. Striving for distinction, groups with limited power rely on the subordination of those beneath them at the expense of reinforcing systems of oppression, which keep most people subservient to the elite white heterosexual men. What about gay white men? They do stuff too. Come on, broad. When victims of rape are blamed for the crimes against them, they experience double victimization or additional forms of suffering and consequences. Their needs are easily overlooked by the legal system and the general public, thus allowing these crimes to continue. Contemporary society reflects a long history of sexual violence against Black women by white men and the legal system that has enabled this violence. Analyzing the rape of enslaved Black women elucidates the reason that white men carried out the sexual violence and the way in which the intersecting forms of oppression work together. The crucial yet often overlooked role of white women in this violence underscores the importance of analyzing groups who hold some degree of privilege while also being oppressed. When analyzing the various forms of exploitation historically and today, the inner workings of intersecting institutions of oppression can be exposed by examining the incentives and behaviors of intermediate groups, reflecting crucial mechanisms at work in the matrix of domination. This work also emphasizes the importance of employing intersectionality historically to expose patterns of behavior and development of institutions which form the basis of present-day society. Exposing this history is crucial to addressing the violent reality that many Black women continue to face today. Although the laws on rape and the rights of Blacks have evolved significantly since slavery, the foundation of systemic racism and racial gender identities formed during the antebellum era persist. Black women continue to be stereotyped as hypersexual in order to justify sexual violence against them, and are often unable to rely on the legal system to effectively address their needs as victims of sexual violence. The identities and roles of white men and women continue to perpetuate racial and gender oppression in ways that reflect each of their positions within the social structure. The in-depth analysis of rape of enslaved Black women by white men, often in this book, is essential for understanding the basis for our current system of gendered racism and behavior of white men and women, which reinforces institutions of oppression. And we're done. How you doing? How many people up here? Ooh, 22, 13. I'm sorry if people's feelings got hurt. Racism is awful, people. If you've experienced it, I can't apologize to people. I can't. I'm sorry if you don't like what I have to say. We have to live this thing every day. I know what it's like to try to intervene. A young woman was raped, and it's a mess. Now, I'm going to take exactly a 2-minute break. Hang in there. I'm going to just introduce a little bit of this book right here. They Were Her Property, because we're talking about white women. And then I'm going to go right back. I'm going to read the introduction of They Were Her Property. It's just a couple of pages. And after that, we're going to get right into, and this is the book I'm going to try to finish. Maybe not tonight, but within, say, the next 2 days, try to take down this entire book, Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So I'm going to read the introduction of They Were Her Property, just so you can have an idea of the next book in line. So, and I'm going to take a short break. I'll come right back. And so just bear with me. But we're going to turn it out. And yes, we have to tell the truth. If you really care about white people, you have to tell white people the truth. And you need to tell Black people the truth. We need to stop lying to each other. Part of this whole thing is lies. The happy slave, the Black rapist. It's just craziness. It's time for us to start dealing with reality. And by the way, I'm not saying stuff because I hate anybody, but just as sure, I do genealogy. If I run across white family members, how quickly people get mad or don't have the stuff blocked, don't want to know you. I mean, I'm not trying to hurt them. I'm trying to get answers. They're still living out
the privilege of having owned and exploited people. Okay, right now, so when people say, I didn't do it, you're a fucking liar. Everybody benefited. If you're in a union, your father was in the union. If that union excluded black men, if you're in a union today and they've moved the trades out of the school so black men couldn't get jobs, you're a beneficiary of it. You're stained. Same way people can see what I look like. Because you don't look like me, you're complicit in the system. Everybody. So stop playing. Don't stop playing with me. I ain't do nothing. No, sure you did. We didn't know Hitler was killing Jews. You're right in the concentration camp. You can't smell the burning hair. You don't see them picking up and beating people. Don't let people do that. And the same can be said of so-called black elites who know better that won't open their mouths in the congressional black circus, or these fake civil rights groups, or these mega church full of coon pastors that can't open their mouths even when their members are killed by the police. Give me 2 minutes. I'll be right back. Okay. Woo! I told you I'd be right back. Okay. Should I switch? I'm gonna switch glasses. Okay. Let's get down. I'm reading the introduction to They Were Her Property by Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. This is when I get done with Harriet Jacobs, or maybe I'll do a little bit of both, depending on how the reading is. Y'all ready? Introduction. Mistresses of the market. In 1859, after touring the antebellum South, the journalist and New York Tribune editor, James Redpath, attempted to explain for his readers why white Southern women opposed emancipation. Did you hear me? Why white Southern women opposed emancipation, Rachel Feinstein. He believed their sentiments, tied to a lifetime of indoctrination, reared as they were under the shadow of the peculiar institution. Slavery was incessantly praised and defended virtually everywhere they went by everyone they knew, and in most of the publications they read. Their consciences, thus early perverted, were never afterwards appealed to, with the result that they saw no reason to change their views. Unlike what Feinstein's saying, no reason to change their views. Redpath assumed that Southern women did not know Negro slavery as it is because their society shielded them from the institution's horrific realities. Insulated by Southern patriarchs, white women seldom saw slavery's most obnoxious features. They never attended auctions, never witnessed examinations, seldom, if ever, see the Negroes lashed. More profoundly, they did not know the interstate trade in slaves was a gigantic commerce. Southern men revealed only the South Side view of slavery. And if the women of the South knew slavery as it is, he was convinced they would join in protest against it. He's thinking this in 1859, and Feinstein in 2019 is saying if they only knew, if they only. Poor white women, they just didn't know. They're not like white men. Redpath's assumptions represent a commonly held patriarchal view. Yet narrative sources, legal and financial documents, and military and government correspondence make it clear that white Southern women knew the most obnoxious features of slavery all too well. Feminist liars, stupid liar, pork chop feminist black women, disloyal bitches. They knew. Slave-owning women not only witnessed the most brutal features of slavery, they took part in them, profited from them, and they defended them. Martha Gibbs was one of those women.
Lit Young, one of Gibbs' former slaves, was interviewed as part of the Federal Writers Project and the Works Progress Administration. We keep hearing about these. Established by the Roosevelt administration in 1935, according to Young, Gibbs was a big, rich Irish woman who weren't scared of no man. She owned and operated a large steam sawmill on the Warner Bayou in Vicksburg, where it emptied into the Mississippi River. She owned a significant number of slaves, so many, in fact, she had to build 2 sets of whitewashed quarters with glass windows to house them all. She also built a nice church with glass windows and a brass cupola for their worship. She fed them well, but she worked them hard too. In step with other slave owners throughout the South, Gibbs employed an overseer to make sure that the people she kept enslaved performed the tasks delegated to them, but she also oversaw her overseer. Almost every morning, she bucked on 2 guns and come out to the place to personally ensure that things were running smoothly. And, quote, she outcussed any man when things didn't go right, close quote. Sound like a weak, passive. Twice married, once widowed, Gibbs would not permit either of her husbands to interfere with her financial affairs, including the management of her slaves. Even though her second husband was a reputable physician in Vicksburg, he had little influence over her or the slave-related activities on their plantation. Lit Young remembered Gibbs' husband addressing her after witnessing the brutal whippings her overseer inflicted upon her slaves. He softly interjected, quote, darling, you ought not whip them poor black folks so hard. They is gonna be free just like us sometimes. Unfazed, she snapped, quote, shut up. Sometimes I believe you as a Yankee anyway, close quote. She was right. During the Civil War, he had served the Union forces by treating injured soldiers. Think about this. If they were talking about him being a Yankee, this means that they were beating the shit out of black people in Reconstruction. After slavery ended, this white woman still had it going on. Just explain that. After the Confederates surrendered, for reasons that remain unclear, local Union officers arrested Martha Gibbs and locked her up in the black folks' church, where they kept her under constant guard for 3 days, fed her hardtack and water, and then released her. After the soldiers set her free, Gibbs freed her slaves, but only temporarily. One day, when her husband had gone to buy corn for his livestock, she gathered up some of her slaves, 10, 16 mule wagons, and 1 ox cook wagon, and set off with them. They walked about 215 miles from Vicksburg, Mississippi, to about 3 miles from Marshall, Texas. She hired Irishman guards with rifles to make sure that none of her free slaves ran away during the journey, and when they stopped to rest, the guards tied the men to trees. Then on Juneteenth, 1866, 1 year after these legally free but still enslaved people made her first crop in Texas, Martha Gibbs finally let them go. Married slave-holding women like Martha Gibbs have received scant attention in historical scholarship. Part of the reason is a bunch of the women that are feminists are too busy trying to deflect and make all white women saints. White women benefited from slavery. They got most of the money.
White women get the money. Rich white men, when they rip off everybody, who do you think the money goes to? Certainly not to black men or black women that they don't marry. It goes to white women. Let's cut the crap. This is a mom and pop operation. Historians have acknowledged that some Southern women owned slaves, but they usually focus on the wealthiest single or widowed women. When they do encounter married slaveholding women in the 19th century records, they generally assume that the woman's legal status as wives prevented them from owning slaves in their own right. Historians rarely differentiate between married women who owned enslaved people in their own right and married women who merely lived in households in which they engaged with, managed, and benefited from the labor of enslaved people that others owned. Historians rarely consider why slave ownership might have mattered to the women in question, to the enslaved people that they owned, to slaveholding communities, to the institution of slavery, or more broadly, to the region. By the way, women aren't held accountable, especially not white women. And black women aren't held accountable. I mean, if you really believe in equality, then everybody gets held accountable, not just people with penises. I'm just saying. Historians have neglected these women because of their behaviors and relationship with their slaves do not conform to the prevailing ideas about white women and slave mastery. In other words, white women wouldn't do that. While it has long been recognized that Southern slave owners were in the minority and that they were by no means a homogeneous group, so much of what scholars know about women and slaveholding South draws upon diaries or letters of the most elite, those living in households that own more than 10 enslaved people. Historians have chronicled their lives, producing microhistories about an extremely small subset of an already small group of white Southerners. Such studies should not be used to make generalizations about the majority of women and slaveholding communities at large. Records indicate that the majority of slave masters owned 10 enslaved people or less, meaning that what you've been told about slavery and women is based on flawed data. And that's why when these feminists with these dumb black women allies who deserve all the DEI abuse that Trump and them are giving y'all deserve it for getting with these folks and you haven't checked them out. Scholars who examine the authority that women held over their slaves frequently focus on the woman's obligatory rather than voluntary or self-initiated management and discipline of enslaved people. They argue, and these are white male scholars, by the way, and white female scholars, which means these people are lying. They argue that women could not be true masters of slaves. Rather, they were fictive masters, even when they possessed the skills and the gall to manage their slaves. These historians argue that they typically did not relish their power. Women are power freaks. Where the hell did they get this crap from? Women are obsessed with power. I haven't met a woman that's not trying to run the man control, especially American women, completely out of order. Bullshit. These historians argue they typically did not relish their power. They did not view their activities as slave mastery. Neither did the Southern laws and courts. This was especially true when it came to violent forms of discipline. White women may punish enslaved people. They might have even been brutal and sadistic, but they fell short of wielding a master's power. And these scholars argued that slaveholding women's acts of violence differ from those of slaveholding men. It's the same way the biggest shoplifters in America are white women. Who's the image of a shoplifter in America? Black men and black women. It's again this whole thing of white women getting the goodies and someone else getting the grief. Now, by extension, many of these scholars flatly reject the idea that white married women could adeptly manage enslaved people without the assistance of men, be they white or black, or that aside from a few exceptional women, they could possess the acumen to do so while also effectively running plantations. Married women, they argue, begrudgingly assumed the roles as deputy husbands and fictive widows when their husbands were away. When their men were present, these women happily and enthusiastically relinquished such responsibilities and exhorted their men to handle what one historian has called a man's business. And in the view of more than a few historians of American slavery and domestic slave trade, this is especially the case when it came to the business of buying and selling and even hiring enslaved people. These scholars claim that the nasty and unseemly business of transacting for human beings was considered ill-suited to white ladies. And they were her property. I build upon these earlier studies, but I also depart from them in significant ways. I focus specifically on women who owned enslaved people in their own right, and in particular on the experiences of married slave-owning women. In addition, I understand these women's fundamental relationship to slavery as a relationship with property, a relation that was above all economic at its foundation. I'm not suggesting that this was these women's only relationship to the institution or that the economic dimension of their relations overrode other aspects of their connections to slavery. Rather, I argue that the pecuniary ties formed one of slave-owning women's primary relations with Black American bondage. The story of these women's economic investments in slavery, I shall argue, tells us much about their economic roles in the institution, the process of nation making that historians did not know or did not want to know about before. The economic historian Sven Beckert has argued that slavery was a key part of American capitalism and that the slave plantations, not railroads, were in fact America's first big business. If we examine women's economic investments in slavery, rather than simply their ideological and sentimental connection to the system, we can uncover hitherto hidden relationships among gender, slavery, and capitalism. The products of these women's economic investment, the people they owned, including the wages enslaved people earned when hired out to others, the cash crops they cultivated, picked, and packed for shipment, and the babies they nursed, were fundamental to the nation's economic growth and to American capitalism. Historians who explore slavery's relationship to capitalism generally focus in on the roles that men played in the development of both. But if we consider the very real possibility that some of the enslaved people these men compelled to work in southern fields actually belonged to their wives, the narratives about American slavery and capitalism would be strikingly different. And when we consider that the enslaved people women owned before they married or acquired afterwards to make the 19th century scale of southern cotton cultivation possible, the narrative of slavery, 19th century markets, and capitalism as a domain of men become unattainable. Adam Smith, the preeminent 18th century economist, argued that a married woman's financial dependence upon her husband bound her to be faithful and constant to her spouse. In line with Smith's thinking, we tend to imagine marriage as a colonial or 19th century woman's primary, if not her only, avenue to financial stability. For many women, this was true, but circumstances existed in which white men were economically dependent upon, even indebted to the women that they married, and this was widely recognized fact even in the North. Abigail Adams, the second First Lady of the United States, advised her son, John Quincy, to postpone marriage until he had accumulated enough property to ensure that he would not be wholly dependent upon the wealth of his future wife that he might bring into their household. When John Quincy hinted at the possibility that he might indeed marry for money, Abigail firmly advised him to never form connections until he saw a prospect of supporting a family. In his response, John Quincy assured his mother that he would never be indebted to his wife for his property.
In the South, slave-holding women possess the kind of wealth that prospective suitors and planners in training hope to acquire or have at their disposal. Why else would John Moore crassly tell his cousins Mary and Richard that the girls bait their hooks with niggers, and the more they can stick on, the better success they would have in securing a worthy husband? According to John Moore, even young women outside the ranks of the most elite slaveholders, who typically own 20 or more slaves, could increase their chances of marrying well if they owned a few. He told his cousins that the girl that has but one or two will get a few nibbles and occasionally catch a trout, but not until he has tried and failed at larger hooks. As this correspondence suggests, some men entered their marriages with little or no wealth, and their unions with property women became their primary avenue for financial independence. A white man's pecuniary circumstances would change drastically upon marriage, because the state and local laws generally gave the husbands control over the property their wives brought into the marriage. Simply marrying a woman with property, as George Washington did with Martha Custis, in case you need an example. Simply marrying a woman with property, even if she maintained control over the man, could improve his position. Husbands often borrowed money from their wives and used enslaved people their wives inherited to cultivate the lands that they bought with those loans. Legal petitions are on record in which women describe themselves as their husbands' creditors and financiers. Many of these women did not accept the loss of their legal claims to property that they brought into their marriage. In fact, many married female petitioners described their slaves as property they still owned, controlled, and considered their husband's control temporary. And as we shall see, the courts often agreed with them. Enslaved people also testified to the ways such ideas shaped marital relationships in white households. Thus, in many respects, married women, their slaves, and their other assets made their husbands' commercial endeavors possible and enabled slavery to thrive in ways it might not have without these women's economic investment in the institution of slavery. I call the women in this book mistresses of the market, but what exactly does that mean? Scholars such as Jennifer Lynn Gross argue that 19th century Southern mistresses assumed roles that were restricted to the dependent position of the daughter, wife, and mother, and the daughters relied completely on their fathers for their public identity, and this dependence transferred to their husbands upon marriage. Because of these constraints, historians contend white Southern women had little to do with enslaved people beyond the household. They generally did not personally own slaves, and when they did, their husbands exercised control over them. Southern mistresses were not adept at slave or plantation management unless extenuating circumstances such as the husband's prolonged absence or death compelled them to be. Even then, such women typically complained about having to take on masculine responsibilities when it came to legal and financial matters. The 19th century Southern mistress resembles a colonial gentlewoman who was less likely to know about, assist in the management of her husband's affairs, or to be involved in a trade or the business of any sort. These women tended to defer to their spouses and male kin and legal and financial matters, and if they did not want to, scholars maintain law and custom forced them to do so. In virtually every dimension of life, then, Southern mistresses were held to be at the mercy of white men. This is a racist, white, feminist interpretation of history. It is a lie. I added that. In this book, I employ the term mistress in a radically different way, one that aligns more closely with its original meaning. In Western Europe, a mistress was a woman who governed, correlative to a subject or to a servant. She was a woman who had something in her possession, and according to the historian Amy Louise Erickson, that something was capital. A mistress also exercised dominion, rule, or power.
Women are powerful. It is a lie. All these weak women, these are folks trying to duck blame. Oh, I didn't know anything about lynching. Well, no, it's only the white men. Bullshit. Bullshit. The term mistress did not signify a married woman's subservient legal position or a woman's subordinate legal status to that of a master. By definition, in fact, a mistress was a master's equivalent. It's equality. There's equality between the racist white woman slaveholder and the racist white male slaveholder. Unlike what we just heard in Rachel, in Rachel's book, what's this tramp's name? Okay, Feinstein, where women were just so far down, they had no power, the men had everything. This is a white woman's cop-out. They're equal. Thus, when South Carolina legislators declared every master, mistress, or overseer shall and may have the liberty to whip any strange Negro or other slave coming to his or their plantation with a ticket, the pass, and that's a pass that an enslaved person had to carry when he or she left the master's estate. It's America's equivalent of South Africa's pass. We had these into the 1960s in various places. So yes, we did. They were not imbuing the mistresses with subordinate powers or power of their husband's stead. They were recognizing the comparable powers and authority that these women possessed. The term used to describe women's control of subordinates was not mastery, but mistressship. Moreover, when formerly enslaved people talk about the control that their masters and mistresses exercise over them, they often accorded equal power to men and women. Robert Falls recalled when his old master and old mistress would say, "Do this." We don't do it. Then they say, "Come here." And if we didn't come to them, they come to us. They brought a bunch of switches with them. Slave-holding women may not have referred to their management of enslaved people as slave mastery, but they used the same strategies and techniques that white male planters described in the management of Negroes, columns that appeared in the pages of agricultural periodicals throughout the South. When we listen to what enslaved people had to say about white women and slave masters, we find that they articulate quite clearly their belief that slave-holding women governed their slaves in the same way that white men did. Sometimes they were more effective in the management, or they used more brutal methods of discipline than their husbands did. White feminists are liars. Western European mistress was defined in another important way that's relevant to the women I discuss in this book, and the central argument that I make. A mistress was a woman who was skilled in anything when it came to the 19th century market of slaves. Southern women were savvy and skilled indeed. They studied the slave market. They evaluated its fluctuation. They blended into the crowds that surrounded public auction blocks and courthouse steps as enslaved people were exposed for sale. They glided past the local slave markets and walked along the streets where slaves were openly displayed. They sat on the front rows of the more aesthetically pleasing slave auction venues, dressed in luxurious silks, satins, and jewels. They sat side by side with other women at public auctions to watch traders and auctioneers sell enslaved people to the highest bidders. But these women did more than observe the procession of black bodies placed before prospective buyers on sale days. White women conducted transactions with slave traders who bought slaves and sold slaves to them as they lounged comfortably within the confines of their homes. They were not meek in their bargaining. Traders often wrote to one another with tales of slave-holding women who harassed them about pending transactions. Other men described women who entered into the slave market to see what kind of merchandise slave traders had for sale. These women touched the testicles, penises, bottoms, vaginas, and breasts, just like white men did. Stop pretending that this is just one gender. Cut the crap. They recalled these women would interrogate and inspect
slaves that piqued their interest. They commented on women who bought and took enslaved people home. Slave-owning women brought legal suits against individuals, both male and female, who jeopardized their claim to human property, and others sued them in kind. They bought and sold slaves for a profit. On rare occasions, they owned slave yards. As one historian, James Oakes, pointed out, some Black people, indigenous people, and women were viable and active members of the master class. Race and gender, however, created unique constraints that these groups had to endure, adapt to, or circumvent. The experience of slave ownership was different for married women. The legal doctrine that placed their persons and their goods under their husband's control compelled them to take extra steps to secure their separate ownership and management of enslaved people, processes that were not required of men. Their legal subordination to their husbands also meant that women could potentially find themselves in court when spouses, kin, and community members jeopardized or violated their property rights or attempted to exploit them. These special contingencies could prove to be insurmountable impediments to Southern women who might hold or want to hold legal title of enslaved people, who might want to exercise control over enslaved people that they own or came to possess. But women discussed in this book were not dismayed or deterred by legal challenges. They and their families took steps necessary to own and maintain control over enslaved people given to them by loved ones or bought or acquired upon, during, and after marriage. Such steps were neither simple nor easy. That women decided to take them to secure slave property for their own use and benefit reveals their deep economic interest and investment in the system of American slavery. Their willingness to do these things suggests that they were more, not less, invested in slavery and its growth than some men were. The historian Susan O'Donovan has argued the South was a region where the slaveries were many and where the freedoms were often assumed numerous and differently gendered shapes. Although she was speaking about the experience of enslaved people in particular, her conceptualization of many freedoms is also useful in understanding the circumstances that the white women discussed in this book confronted and created. For them, slavery was their freedom. Black slavery, Black subordination, Black exploitation is white female power. Get it? Get it, dumbass Black feminists? Stupid hoes. They created a freedom for themselves based on Black subordination. By actively engaging and investing in the economy of slavery and keeping Black Americans in captivity. Racism is white female power. Their decision to invest in the economy of slavery and their actions that followed those decisions were not part of a grand scheme to secure women's rights or gender equality. That's some bullshit they created to use us after Black folk got free and they needed a new game. Has nothing to do. White women don't care about that. They got dumbass Black women into this stuff. God, our women are stupid. Sorry, I'm going to keep calling you Black women stupid until you wake up. Nevertheless, slave ownership allowed Southern women to mitigate some of the harshest elements of the common law regime as it operated in their daily lives. Women's economic investment in slavery, especially when they used legal loopholes to circumvent legal constraints, allowed them to interact with the state and their communities differently. So all this, they had no power, is garbage. And these women's actions challenged current understanding of white male dominance within Southern households and communities in the antebellum era. In countless ways, then, slave-owning women invested in and profited from their financial ties to American slavery and its marketplace. Yet they rarely documented those economic connections. However, white men and enslaved people themselves did make note and speak of their activities, which the Civil War made tenuous and to which abolition eventually put to an end. When the Federal Writers Project employees traveled through the South searching out glimpses of the past through the interviews with formerly enslaved Black Americans, individuals like Lit Young discussed and identified their female owners, serving as metaphorical flies on the walls of Southern households. Formerly enslaved people talked about some of the most violent, traumatic, and intimate dimensions of life of those who were free, who were bound and who were free. They heard and saw things typically remained obscured from view. Details of white slave-owning couples that often left out personal correspondence or public communications. That is, when they were able to write at all. Many slave-holding women I discuss in this book contended with some form of illiteracy. They either were unable to read or write or possess the ability to do one, but not the other. Enslaved and formerly enslaved people's recollection about their female owners thus serve as some of the only archival records about these women to survive. The nature of slavery all but guaranteed that formerly enslaved people would relocate many times, be compelled to work in different regions of the South, and possibly cultivate different crops in different climates over the course of their lives. The government employees who interviewed them worked from a questionnaire that did not include any questions about whether or how their experiences of enslavement changed as they moved across the South. While some formerly enslaved people did offer details off script, others simply chose to answer the questions posed. Some historians caution scholars against relying on the testimonies of former slaves gathered in the mid-20th century. They contend that formerly enslaved people could not have possibly understood what slavery entailed because, after all, most of them were only children when slavery thrived in the South. Furthermore, they suggest that even if the survivors were old enough to have experienced their bondage in all its dimensions, it is unlikely that they remember the details as clearly after such a long period of time. Some 70 years had intervened between emancipation and the interviews. Moreover, most of the interviewers were white Southerners, many descendants of slave owners, and in the face of such people, formerly enslaved interviewees probably felt intimidated and confused and were less likely to offer candid accounts of what they endured in bondage or the people who kept them enslaved. That many of the people interviewed in the 1930s were children during their bondage and was certainly the case, but it's not true of all of them. Some women like Delia Garlick was grown up when the war came and was a mother before it closed. She was a centenarian when Margaret Fowler interviewed her in 1937. Similarly, Willis Benefield, who believed that he was 35 years old when freedom was declared, the WPA interviewers talked to many others like them. And additionally, although many formerly enslaved people were young when they were freed, it is unlikely that they could forget what psychologists and gerontologists call the salient life events, pivotal experiences such as marriages, births, deaths, and the context of slavery, brutal beatings, sexual assaults, or familial separations that occurred after the sale or the relocation of loved ones. Delicia Patterson, for example, was 15 when her owner brought her to the courthouse and put her up on the auction block to be sold. When Ann Maddox was 13, she was part of a speculators drove that traveled from Virginia to Alabama. Tom Magruder was the oldest living slave, one of the oldest living ex-slaves in Pulaski County, was 18 or 20 when he was sold for $1,250. These formerly enslaved people could not forget such events or the slave owners who initiated them and were ultimately responsible for the trauma that followed. Moreover, remembering certain details about their bondage could mean the difference between life and death for such people, both during and after slavery. As formerly enslaved people navigated the Southern landscape, their safety, sometimes their very lives, often depend on their ability to produce passes or tickets which accurately describe their owners, among other things, and their continued ties to white families that previously owned them could spare them some of the racial violence that characterized the Reconstruction in the South. Formerly enslaved people may have found their interviews tense and uncomfortable, but many of them spoke openly of the tragedies and traumas of slavery nonetheless. Despite the possibility of provoking a violent reaction, formerly enslaved people spoke with their white interviewers about matters as intimate as cross-racial sex violence, white paternity of enslaved children, and incest, and as horrifying as torture inflicted by their masters and mistresses or former owners who murdered enslaved people. They argued that these were the things, along with the constant threat of sale, that would remove from their homes and families, that they could never forget, regardless of how much time had elapsed. Furthermore, the interviewers did not always give their testimony in isolation. Family, friends, and individuals who came to assist some elderly, formerly enslaved people with daily tasks were often present during their interviews. When the FWP employee Zoe Posey visited Mary Harris to interview her about slavery for a second time, she was confronted by Harris's angry son, who initially prevented her from continuing her queries. He interrogated about her intentions and proclaimed slavery. Why are you concerned about such stuff? It's bad enough for it to have existed. And when can we can't forget it, there's no need of rehashing it. At such an outburst, Posey may have been the one who was intimidated during the encounter, not her interview subject. To be sure, formerly enslaved people often responded to questions about their enslavement with silence because they did not always want to remember or talk about their experiences, but thousands chose to do so, despite the reservations. They told their stories in the atmosphere of intense racial hostility in a region where simply refusing to step off the sidewalk when a white person passed could result in their deaths. They believed that in telling their stories was worth these risks. I honor their courage. I heed their words. The foreground of their testimony and remembrances in this book. As I wrote, I grappled with whether to include terms like nigger that might be offensive to my readers and seem disparaging to my African American subjects. However, I decided to include the language used by the interviews because they're some of the best sources we have for understanding how enslaved people understood their lives and their worlds. In addition, making any changes to the text presented its own problems. Such revisions would sanitize the experiences of these formerly enslaved people and make it difficult for readers to understand how they perceived what had happened to them. They did not have to tell their stories, and they received little or nothing in recompense for their interviews. Nonetheless, they did tell their stories, and in the ways they felt most comfortable. In this book, they speak in their own words. Slave-owning women rarely talked about the economic investments in slavery, and they wrote about them even less. Their silences did not reflect their aversion to slavery or human trafficking. Many of them simply didn't have the time or the skill to put their thoughts on paper, while those who did probably saw the pecuniary investment in slavery as commonplace and unworthy of a note. This is their story. No group spoke about women's investment in slavery more often or more powerfully than enslaved people subjected to their ownership and control. They were the people whose lives were changed forever when a mistress sold someone just so she could buy a new dress. They were best equipped to describe the agony that shook their bodies and souls when they returned from their errands to discover their children were gone and that their mistresses were counting piles of money they had just received from slave traders who bought them. Only enslaved people can speak about their female owners' profound economic contributions to their continued enslavement with such astonishing precision. This is their story, too. Completed. That was the intro to the next book in our anti-feminist series. How do you guys like it? It's 18 here, so that's 30, 32, 35 people. They were her property. Get a copy. This is a damn good book. I bought a second one. Now, we're going to start the book we've been waiting for. Holy Jesus.
This book is kind of long. I was listening to it on tape. Listen, I got to share some of this. So let me see if I can do a couple of pages of this. See if I can get through some of this. Y'all ready? Y'all ready for Harriet Jacobs? Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. This is 197 pages. I may have to do this over. May have to do it over the course of 2 days. But we're going to get this. No, every month is Black History Month. This is the preface to Harriet Jacobs' book, prefaced by the author. Reader, be assured that this narrative is no fiction. I'm aware that some of my adventures seem to be incredible, but they are, nevertheless, strictly true. I have not exaggerated the wrongs inflicted by slavery. On the contrary, my descriptions fall far short of the facts. I have concealed the names of places and given persons fictitious names. I had no motive for secrecy on my own account, but deemed it kind and considerate towards others to pursue this course. I wish I were more competent in the task I've undertaken, but I trust my readers will excuse deficiencies in the consideration of circumstances. I was born and reared in slavery, and I remained a slave in a slave state 27 years. Since I've been at the North, it has been necessary for me to work diligently for my own support and the education of my children. This has not left me much leisure to make up for the loss of early opportunities to improve myself, and it has compelled me to write these pages at irregular intervals whenever I could snatch an hour from household duties. When I first arrived in Philadelphia, Bishop Payne, this is Bishop Payne of the AME Church, advised me to publish a sketch of my life, but I told him I was altogether incompetent to such an undertaking. Though I've improved my mind somewhat since that time, I still remain of the same opinion, but I trust my motives will excuse what might otherwise seem presumptuous. I have not written my experiences in order to attract attention to myself. On the contrary, it would have been more pleasant for me to have been silent about my own history. Neither do I care to excite sympathy for my own suffering. But I do earnestly desire to arouse the women of the North to a realizing sense of the condition of 2 millions of women at the South, still in bondage, suffering what I suffered, and most of them far worse. I want to add my testimony to that of Abel Pence to convince the people of the free states what slavery really is. Only our experiences can one realize how deep, dark, and foul is that pit of abominations. May the blessing of God rest on this imperfect effort on behalf of my persecuted people. Her pseudonym was Linda Brent, but this is Harriet Jacobs. And I want to start off by saying, may the blessing of God rest on this imperfect effort on behalf of my persecuted people. Rachel Feinstein and all these other white feminists act as if, and I'll say this to all the Black folk out there who disgust me to my guts, your ancestors, many of them, the spear tip of resisting slavery, were Christian, God-fearing people who read the Bible. That's what kept them going. They're doing a hell of a lot better than those of us who've turned our backs on what got our ancestors through. All you fools out there talk about ancestors and ancestry and honoring them. How can you honor them if you curse and spit on and take a shit on what they believed? That's outrageous. And you conscious community Negroes or niggers out there that are saying that this woman's running after white Jesus and that the Bible made everybody weak and stupid and they couldn't stand it. You're absolutely crazy.
And most people haven't taken the time to read what your ancestors who could read and write were saying. That's why I want to read this book. I'm tired of people talking about slavery and what it did and how it's, and instead of listening to people who are able to tell people what it meant, how they got through what they did, let us dignify our ancestors. In this next month of Black History Month, we're going to call this Black Women's History Month, to listen to what they said, not what people who are leftists or Marxists or atheists or anarchists or into some kind of stupid cult religion, or they want to cut chickens or burn sage. Listen to what this woman said about her life, what helped her. I keep mentioning this because I'm disgusted by people, and I've heard this, and I'm angry. I remember hearing from really stupid-ass, corrupt people at Howard that were raping everybody, that Christianity made everybody Black a slave, and it made you a traitor to the community. And yet, when you ask about Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Alexander, they haven't read these people. They have a desire to get rid of this. That's dishonest. It's fraud. It's a lie. And I'm here to call you guys liars. And because the historical record is on my side, what you feel doesn't matter worth a damn. That's why I talk to you with the disrespect that I do. You're hurting and destroying your community, and you belong in hell. Hell is too good for you. Now I'll start reading. Chapter 1. I was born a slave, but I never knew it till 6 years of happy childhood had passed away. My father was a carpenter and considered so intelligent and skillful in his trade that when building out of the common line were to be corrected, he was sent from long distances to be the head workman. On the condition of paying his mistress $200 a year and supporting himself, he was allowed to work at his trade and manage his own affairs. His strongest wish was to purchase his children, but though he several times offered his hard earnings for that purpose, he never succeeded. In complexion, my parents were a light shade of brownish yellow and were termed mulattoes. They lived together in a comfortable home, and though we were all slaves, I was so fondly shielded that I never dreamed I was a piece of merchandise, trusted to them for safekeeping and liable to be demanded of them at any moment. I had one brother, William, who was 2 years younger than myself, a bright, affectionate child. I had also great treasure, and my maternal grandmother, who was a remarkable woman in many respects. She was the daughter of a planter in South Carolina, who at his death left her mother and her 3 children free, with money to go to St. Augustine, where they had relatives. It was during the Revolutionary War that they were captured on their passage, carried back, and sold to different purchasers. Such was the story my grandmother used to tell me, but I do not remember all the particulars. She was a little girl when she was captured and sold to the keeper of a large hotel. I have often heard her tell how hard she fared during childhood, but as she grew older, she evinced so much intelligence and was so faithful that her master and mistress could not help saying it was for their interest to take care of such a valuable piece of property. She became an indispensable personage in the household, officiating in all the capacities from cook and wet nurse to seamstress. She was much praised for her cooking, and her nice crackers became so famous in the neighborhood that many people were desirous of obtaining them. In consequence of numerous requests of this kind, she asked permission of her mistress to bake crackers at night after all the housework was done, and she obtained the leave to do it, provided she would clothe herself and her children from the profits. Upon these terms, after working all day for her mistress, she began her midnight bakings, assisted by her 2 oldest children. The business proved profitable, and each year she, laid by little, was saved for a fund to purchase her children. Her master died, and the property was divided among his heirs. The widow had her dower in the hotel, and which she continued to keep open. My grandmother remained in her service as a slave, but her children were divided among her master's children. As she had five, Benjamin, the youngest one, was sold in order that each heir may have an equal portion of dollars and cents. There was so little difference in our ages that he seemed more like my brother than my uncle. He was a bright and handsome lad, nearly white, for he had inherited the complexion of my grandmother, that complexion my grandmother had derived from the Anglo-Saxon ancestors. Though only 10 years old, $720 were paid for him. His sale was a terrible blow to my grandmother, but she was naturally hopeful. She went back to work with renewed energy, trusting in time to be able to purchase some of her children. She had laid up $300 since her mistress one day begged as a loan, promising to pay her soon. The reader probably knows that no promise or writing was given to a slave is legally binding. For according to Southern laws, a slave being property can hold no property. When my grandmother lent her hard earnings to her mistress, she trusted solely to her honor, the honor of a slaveholder to a slave. To this good grandmother I was indebted for my many comforts. My brother William and I received a portion of the crackers, cakes, and preserves she made to sell, and after we ceased to be children, we were indebted to her for many more important services. Such were the unusually fortunate circumstances of my early childhood. When I was 6 years old, my mother died, and then, for the first time, I learned by the talk around me that I was a slave. My mother's mistress was the daughter of my grandmother's mistress. She was the foster sister of my mother, and they were both nourished at my grandmother's breast. In fact, my mother had been weaned at 3 months old that the babe of the mistress might obtain sufficient food. They played together as children, and when they became women, my mother was a most faithful servant to her white foster sister. On her deathbed, her mistress promised that her children should never suffer for anything during her lifetime. She kept her word. They all spoke kindly of my dead mother, who had been a slave merely in name, but in nature was noble and womanly. I grieved for her, and my young mind was troubled with the thought, who would now take care of me and my little brother? I was told my home was now to be with her mistress, and I found it a happy one. No toilsome, disagreeable duties were imposed on me. My mistress was so kind to me that I was always glad to do her bidding and proud to labor for her as much as my young years would permit. I would sit down by her side for hours sewing diligently with a heart of as free from care as any freeborn white child. When she thought I was tired, she would send me out to run and jump, and away I bounded to gather berries or flowers to decorate her room. Those were happy days, too happy to last. A slave child has no thought for the morrow. But there came that blight, which too surely waits on every human being born to be a chattel. When I was nearly 12 years old, my kind mistress sickened and died. As I saw the cheeks grow paler, the eyes more glassy, how earnestly I prayed in my heart that she might live. I loved her, for she had been almost like a mother to me. My prayers were not answered. She died, and they buried her in the little churchyard, where the day after day my tears fell upon her grave. I was sent to spend a week with my grandmother. I was now old enough to begin to think of the future, and again, I asked myself, what will they do with me? I felt sure I would never find another mistress so kind as the one who was gone. She had promised my dying mother and her children should never suffer for anything. And when I remembered that, I recalled her many proofs of attachment to me. I could not help having some hope that she left me free. My friends were almost certain that it wouldn't be so. They had thought she would be sure to do it on account of my mother's love and faithful service. But alas, we all know the memory of a faithful slave does not avail much to save her children from the auction block.
After a brief period of suspense, the will of my mistress was read, and we learned she had bequeathed me to her sister's daughter, a child of 5 years old. So vanished our hopes. My mistress had taught me the precepts of God's word. Thou shalt love neighbor as thyself. Whosoever ye would that men should do unto you, do ye even so unto them. But I was her slave, and I suppose she did not recognize me as her neighbor. I would have, I would give much to blot out from my memory that one great wrong. As a child, I loved my mistress, and looking back on the happy days I spent with her, I try to think with less bitterness than this act of injustice. While I was with her, she taught me to read and spell, and for this privilege, which rarely falls to the lot of a slave, I bless her memory. She possessed but a few slaves. At her death, those were all distributed among her relatives. 5 of them were my grandmother's children and had shared the same milk that nourished her mother's children. Notwithstanding my grandmother's long and faithful service to her owners, not one of her children escaped the auction block. These God-breathing machines are no more. The sight of their masters, then the cotton field the cotton they plant, and the horses they tend. Chapter 2, New Master, New Mistress. Dr. Flint, a physician in the neighborhood, had married the sister of my mistress. I was now the property of their little daughter, and it was not without murmuring that I had prepared for my new home. And what added to my unhappiness was the fact that my brother William was purchased by the same family. My father, by his nature as well by the habit of transacting business as a skillful mechanic, had more the feelings of a freeman than is common among slaves. My brother was a spirited boy, being brought up under such influences. He daily detested the name of master and mistress. One day, when his father and his mistress both happened to call him at the same time, he hesitated between the two, being perplexed to know which one had the strongest claim upon his obedience. He finally concluded to go to the mistress. When my father reproved him for it, he said, "You both called me. I didn't know which I ought to go to first." "You are my child," replied our father, "and when I call you, you should come immediately, if you have to pass through fire and water." Poor Willie. He was now to learn his first lesson of obedience to a master. Grandmother tried to cheer us with hopeful words, and they found an echo in this credulous hearts of youth. When we entered our new home, we encountered cold looks, cold words, and cold treatment. We were glad when the night came. On my narrow bed, I moaned and I wept. I felt so desolate and alone. I had been there nearly a year when our dear little friend of mine was buried. I heard her mother sob, this is a little 5-year-old, and the clods fell on the coffin of her only child. I turned away from the grave, feeling thankful that I was still something left to love. I met my grandmother, who said, "Come with me, Linda." From her tone, I knew something sad had happened. She led me apart from the people and then said, "My child, your father is dead." Dead? How could I believe it? He had died so suddenly. I hadn't even heard that he was sick. I went home with my grandmother. My heart rebelled against God, who had taken from me my mother, father, mistress, and friend. The good grandmother tried to comfort me. "Who knows the ways of God?" said she. Perhaps they had been kindly taken from the evil days to come. Years afterwards, I often thought of this. She promised to be a mother to her grandchildren, so far as she might be permitted to do so. And strengthened by her love, I returned to my master's. I thought I should be allowed to go to my father's house the next morning, but I was ordered to go for flowers, that my mistress' house may be decorated for the evening party. I spent the day gathering flowers and weaving them into festoons while the dead body of my father was lying within a mile of me. What cared my owners for that? He was merely a piece of property. Moreover, they thought he had spoiled his children by teaching them to feel that they were human beings. This was a blasphemous doctrine for a slave to teach,
presumptuous in him and dangerous to the masters. The day I followed his remains to the humble grave beside that of my dear mother, there were those who knew my father's worth and respected his memory. My home now seemed more dreary than ever. The laugh of the little slave children sounded harsh and cruel. It was selfish to feel so about the joy of others. My brother moved about with a very grave face. I tried to comfort him, saying, "Take courage, Willie. Brighter days will come by and by." "You don't know anything about it, Linda," he replied. "We shall have to stay here all our days. We shall never be free." I argued that we were growing older and stronger, and that perhaps we might, before long, be allowed to hire our own time. Then we could earn money to buy our freedom. William declared this was much easier to say than to do. Moreover, he did not intend to buy his freedom. We held daily controversies upon this subject. Little attention was paid to slave meals in Dr. Flint's house. If they could catch a bit of food while it was going, well and good. I gave myself no trouble on that score, for in my various errands I passed my grandmother's house, and there was always something to spare for me. I was frequently threatened with punishment if I stopped there, and my grandmother, to avoid detaining me, often stood at the gate with something for breakfast or dinner. I was indebted to her for all of my comfort, spiritual or temporal. It was her labor that supplied my scanty wardrobe. I have a vivid recollection of the linsey woolsey dress given to me every winter by Miss Flint's. How I hated it. It was one of the badges of slavery. While my grandmother was thus helping support me from her hard earnings, the $300 she lent her mistress were never repaid. When her mistress died, her son-in-law, Dr. Flint, was appointed executor. When my grandmother applied to him for repayment, he said the state was insolvent and the law prohibited payment. It did not, however, prohibit him from retaining the silver candelabra which had been purchased with that money. I presume that will will be handed down in the family for generation to generation. My grandmother's mistress had always promised her that at her death she should be free, and it was said that her will made good on the promise. But when the estate was settled, Dr. Flint told the old faithful servant, under existing circumstances, it was necessary that she be sold. On the appointment day, the customary advertisement was posted up proclaiming that there would be a public sale of Negroes, horses, etc. Dr. Flint called to tell my grandmother he was unwilling to wound up her feelings by putting her up at auction, that he would prefer to dispose of her at a private sale. My grandmother saw through his hypocrisy. She understood very well that he was ashamed of the job. She is a very spirited woman, and if he was base enough to sell her, then her mistress intended she should be free. She was determined that the public should know it. She for a long time has supplied many families with crackers and preserves. Consequently, Aunt Marthy, as she was called, was generally known, and everybody that knew her respected her intelligence and good character. Her long, faithful service to the family was also well known, and the intention of the mistress to leave her free. When the day of the sale came, she took her place among the chattels. At the first call, she sprang up on the auction block. Many voices shouted out, "Shame, shame! Who is going to sell you, Aunt Marty? Don't stand there. That is no place for you." Without saying a word, she quietly awaited her fate. No one bid for her. At last, a feeble voice said $50. It came from a maiden lady, 70 years old, the sister of my grandmother's deceased mistress. She had lived 40 years under the same roof with my grandmother. She knew how faithfully she had served her owners and how cruelly she had been defrauded of her rights, and she resolved to protect her. The auctioneer waited for a higher bidder, but her wishes were respected. No one bid above her. She could neither read nor write, but when the bill of sale was made out, she signed it with the cross. But what consequence was that when she had a big heart overflowing with human kindness? She gave the old servant her freedom. At that time, my grandmother was just 50 years old. Laborious years had passed since then, and now my brother and I were slaves to the man who had defrauded her of her money, tried to defraud her of her freedom. One of my mother's sisters, called Aunt Nancy, was also a slave in his family. She was a kind and good aunt to me, supplied the place of both housekeeper and waiting maid to her mistress. She was, in fact, at the beginning and end of everything. Mrs. Flint, like many Southern women, was totally deficient in energy. She had not the strength to superintend her house affairs, but her nerves were so strong she could sit in her easy chair and see a woman whipped until blood trickled from every stroke of the lash. She was a member of the church, but partaking of the Lord's Supper did not seem to put her in a Christian frame of mind. If dinner was not served at the exact time on a particular Sunday, she would station herself in the kitchen and wait until it was dished, and then spit in all the kettles and the pans that had been used for cooking. She did this as to prevent the cook and her children from eking out a meager fare with the remains of gravy and other scrappings. Slaves could get nothing to eat except what she chose to give them. Provisions were weighed out by the pound and the ounces 3 times a day. I can assure you that she gave them no chance to eat wheat bread of her flour barrel. She knew how many biscuits a quart of flour would make and exactly what size they ought to be. Dr. Flint was an epicure. The cook never sent dinner to his table without fear and trembling, for if there happened to be a dish not to his liking, he would either order her to be whipped or compel her to eat every mouthful in his presence. The poor hungry creature might not have objected to eating it, but she did object to having her master cram it down her throat. Cram it down her throat until she choked. Wow, these are some mean-ass people. Now, they had a pet dog. What a nuisance in the house. The cook was ordered to make some Indian mush for him. He refused to eat, and when his head was held over it, the froth flowed from his mouth into the basin. He died a few minutes later. When Dr. Flint came in, he said the mush had not been well cooked, and that was the reason the animal would not eat it. He sent for the cook and compelled her to eat it. He thought the woman's stomach was stronger than the dog's, but her sufferings afterwards proved that he was mistaken. This poor woman endured many cruelties from her master and mistress, sometimes was locked away from her nursing baby for the whole day and night. When I had been in the family a few weeks, one of the plantation slaves was brought to town by order of his master. It was near night when he arrived, and Dr. Flint ordered him to be taken to the workhouse, tied up to the joist so that his feet would just escape the ground. In this situation, he was to wait until the doctor had taken his tea. I will never forget that night. Never before in my life had I heard of hundreds of blows fall in succession on a human being. His piteous groans and his "Oh, pray don't, master," rang in my ears for months afterwards. There were many conjectures as to the cause of this terrible punishment. Some said master accused him of stealing corn. Others said the slave had quarreled with his wife in the presence of the overseer and had accused the master of being the father of her child. They were both black, and the child was very fair. I went to the workhouse the next morning and saw the cowhide still wet with blood, the boards all covered with gore. The man lived and continued to quarrel with his wife. A few months after, Dr. Flint handed them over to a slave trader. The guilty man put their value into his pocket and had the satisfaction of knowing that they were out of sight and hearing. When the mother delivered it into the trader's hands, she said, "You promised to treat me well," to which he replied, "You have let your tongue run too far, damn you." She had forgotten that it was a crime for a slave to tell who was the father of her child. For others than the master, persecution comes in such cases.
I once saw a young girl dying soon after the birth of a child, nearly white. In her agony, she cried out, "O Lord, come and take me." Her mistress stood by and mocked her like an incarnate fiend. "You suffer, do you?" she exclaimed. "I'm glad of it. You deserve it all, and more too." The girl's mother said, "The baby is dead, thank God, and I hope my poor child will be in heaven too." "Heaven," retorted the mistress. "There's no such like place for the like of her and her bastard." The poor mother turned away sobbing. Her daughter called her feebly as she bent over her and heard her say, "Don't grieve so, mother. God knows all about it, and he will have mercy upon me." Her sufferings afterwards became so intense that the mistress felt unable to stay. But when she left the room, a scornful smile was still on her lips. 7 children called her mother. The poor black woman had but one child whose eyes she saw closing in death, while she thanked God for taking her from the greater bitterness in life. Chapter 3: The Slave's New Year. Dr. Flint owned a fine residence in town, several farms, and about 50 slaves, besides hiring a number by the year. Hiring day at the South takes place on the 1st of January. On the 2nd, the slaves were expected to go to their new masters. On a farm, they work until the corn and cotton are laid. They have 2 holidays. Some masters give them a good dinner under the tree. This over, they work until Christmas Eve. If no heavy charges are meantime brought against them, they're given 4 or 5 holidays, which means whatever the master or overseer may think is proper. Then comes New Year's Eve, and they gather together their little alls, or more properly speaking, their little nothings, and wait anxiously for the dawning of the day. At the appointed hour, the grounds are thronged with men and women and children, waiting like animals to hear their doom pronounced. The slave is sure to know who is the most humane or cruel master within 40 miles of him. It is easy to find out on that day who clothes and feeds his slaves well, for he is surrounding the crowd, begging, "Please, master, hire me for this year. I will work very hard, master." If a slave is unwilling to go with his new master, he is whipped or locked up in jail until he consents to go and promises not to run away during a year. Should he chance to change his mind, thinking it justifiable to violate the extorted promise, woe to him if he is caught. The whip is used until the blood flows at his feet, and his stiffened limbs are put in chains to be dragged in the field for days and days. If he lives until the next year, perhaps the same man will hire him again, even without giving him an opportunity of going to the hiring ground. After those hired are disposed of, those for sale are called up. Oh, you happy free women, contrast your New Year's Day with that of a poor bondwoman. With you it is a pleasant season, as the light of the day is blessed. Friendly wishes meet you everywhere, and gifts are showered upon you. Even hearts that may have been estranged from you soften at this season. And the lips have been silent back echo, "I wish you a happy new year." Children bring little offerings and raise up their rosy lips for a caress. They are your own. No hand but that of death can take them from you. But to the slave mothers, New Year's Day comes laden with peculiar sorrows. She sits on her cold cabin floor watching the children who may be torn from her the next morning. And often does she wish that she might die before the day dawns. She may be an ignorant creature degraded by the system that has brutalized her from childhood, but she has a mother's instinct and is capable of feeling a mother's agony. On the one of these sale days, I saw a mother lead 7 children to the auction block. She knew that some of them would be taken from her, but they took all. The children were sold to a slave trade, and their mother was brought to them by the man in her town. Before all of her children were far away, she begged the trader to tell her where he intended to take them. This he refused to do.
How could he when he knew he would sell them one by one, wherever he could command the highest price? I met that mother in the street. Her wild, haggard face lives today in my mind. She wrung her hands in anguish, exclaimed, "Gone, all gone. Why didn't God kill me?" I had no words wherewith to comfort her. Instances of this kind are daily, yea, hourly occurrence. Slaveholders have a method peculiar with their institution of getting rid of old slaves whose lives have been worn out by their service. I knew of an old woman who was 70 years faithful, served her master. She had become helpless from hard labor and disease. Her owners moved to Alabama, and this old woman was left to be sold to anybody that would give $20 for her. Chapter 4. The Slave That Dared to Feel Like a Man. 2 years had passed since I entered Dr. Flint's family, and those years had brought much knowledge that comes from the experience, though they had afforded little opportunity for any other kinds of knowledge. My grandmother had, as much as possible, been a mother to her orphan grandchildren. By perseverance and unwearied industry, she was now the mistress of a snug little home, surrounded with the necessities of life. She would have been happy could her children have shared them with her. There remained but 3 children and 2 grandchildren, all slaves. Most earnestly did she strive to make us feel that it was the will of God, that He had seen fit to place us under such circumstances. Though it seemed hard, we ought to pray for contentment. It was a beautiful faith coming from a mother who could not call her children her own, but I and Benjamin, her youngest boy, condemned it. We reasoned that it was much more than the will of God that we should be situated where she was. We longed for a home like hers. There was always sweet balsam for our troubles. She was so loving and so sympathizing. She always met us with a smile and listened with patience to all of our sorrows. She spoke so hopefully that unconsciously the clouds gave place to sunshine. There was a grand big oven there, too, that baked bread and nice things for the town, and we knew that there was always a choice bit in store for us. But alas, even the charms of the old oven failed to reconcile us to our hard lot. Benjamin was now tall and a handsome lad, strongly and gracefully made, with a spirit that was too bold and daring for a slave. My brother William was now 12 years old and had the same aversion to the word master that he had when he was an urchin of 7 years. I was his confidant. He came to me with all of his troubles. I remember one instance in particular. It was during a lovely spring morning when I marked the sunlight dancing here and there, and its beauty seemed to mock my sadness, for my master, whose restless craving, vicious nature, rove about day and night, seeking whom to devour, had just left me with the stinging, scorching words that scathed my ear and brain like fire. Oh, how I despised him. I thought now how glad I should be if some day, when he walked the earth, it would open up and swallow him up and disencumber the world of a plague. When he told me I was made for his use, you're talking about sex, people, made to obey his command in everything, that I was nothing but a slave whose will must and should surrender to his. Never before had my puny arm felt half so strong. So deeply was I absorbed in the painful reflections afterward that I neither saw nor heard the entrance of anyone till the voice of William sounded close beside me. "Linda," said he, "what makes you so sad? I love you. Oh, Linda, isn't this a bad world? Everybody seems so cross and unhappy. I wish I had died when poor father did." I told him that everybody was not cross or unhappy, that those who had pleasant homes and kind friends, who were not afraid to love them, were happy. But we were slave children without a father or mother, could not expect to be happy. We must be good, perhaps that would bring us contentment. "Yes," he said, "I'll try to be good,
But what's the use? They are all the time troubling me. Then he proceeded to relate his afternoon difficulty with young Master Nicholas. It seemed that the brother of Nicholas had pleased himself making up stories about William. Master Nicholas said he should be flogged, and he would do it, whereupon he went out to work, but William fought bravely, and the young master, finding he was getting the better of him, undertook to tie his hands behind him. He failed in that likewise. By dint of kicking and fisting, William came out of the skirmish, none the worse for a few scratches. He continued to discourse on his young master's meanness, how he whipped the little boys, but was a perfect coward when a tussle ensued between him and white boys of his own size. On such occasions, he always took to his legs. William had other charges to make against him. One, he was rubbing his pennies with quicksilver and passing them off for quarters of a dollar to an old man who kept a fruit stall. William was often sent to buy fruit and earnestly inquired of me what ought he do under such circumstances. I told him that it was certainly wrong to deceive the old man, and that it was his duty to tell the impositions practiced by the young master. I assured him that the old man would not be slow to comprehend the whole, but there was a matter within. William thought it might with the old man, but not with him. He said he did not mind. He did not mind the smart of the whip, but he did not like the idea of being whipped. While I advised him to be good and forgiving, I was not unconscious of the beam in my own eye. It was very knowledgeable in my own shortcomings that urged me to remain, if possible, some sparks of my brother's God-given nature. I had not lived 14 years in slavery for nothing. I had felt, seen, and heard enough, and read in the characters and questions the motives of those around me. The war of my life had begun. As though one of God's powerless creatures, I resolved never to be conquered. Alas for me! If there was one pure sunny spot for me, I believed it to be in Benjamin's heart, and in another so I'm loved with all the ardor of a girl's first love. My owner knew of it and sought in every way to render me miserable. He did not resort to corporal punishment, but to all petty tyrannical ways that human ingenuity could devise. I remember the first time I was punished. It was in the month of February. My grandmother had taken my old shoes and replaced them with a new pair. I needed them, for several inches of snow had fallen and continued to fall. When I walked through Mrs. Flint's room, their creaking grated harshly on her refined nerves. She called me to her and asked me about how I made such a horrid noise, and I told her, "It's my new shoes." "Take them off," she said, "and if you put them on again, I'll throw them into the fire." I took them off and my stockings also. Then she sent me on a long distance on an errand. As I went through the snow, my bare feet tingled. That night I was very hoarse. I went to bed thinking the next day would find me sick, perhaps dead. What was my grief was waking to find myself quite well. I had imagined if I had died or laid up for some time that my mistress would feel a twinge of remorse that she so hated the little imp, as she styled me. It was my ignorance of the mistress that gave rise to such extravagant imaginings. Dr. Flint occasionally had high prices offered for me, but he always said, "She don't belong to me. She's my daughter's property, and I have no right to sell her." Good, honest man, my young mistress was still a child. I could look for no protection from her. I loved her, and she returned my affection. I once heard her father allude to her attachment to me, and his wife promptly replied that it proceeded from fear. But this unpleasant doubt into my mind, did the child feign that she did not feel, or was their mothers jealous of the might of love that she bestowed on me? I concluded it must be the latter, and I said to myself, surely little children are true. One afternoon I sat at my sewing, feeling unusual depression in spirits. My mistress has been accusing me of an offense,
of which I assured her I was perfectly innocent, but I saw, by the contemptuous curl of her lips, that she believed I was telling a lie. I wondered for what purpose, what wise purpose God was leading me through such thorny paths, whether still darker ways were in store for me. As I sat musing thus, the door opened softly and William came in. "Well, brother," I said, "what is the matter this time?" "Oh, Linda, Ben and his master have had a dreadful time," he said. "My first thought was Benjamin was killed. Don't be frightened, Linda," said William. "I'll tell you about it. It appeared Benjamin's master had sent for him. He did not immediately obey the summons. When he did, the master was angry and began to whip him. He resisted. The master and slave fought, and the master was finally thrown. Benjamin had cause to tremble, for he had thrown to the ground the master, one of the richest men in town. I anxiously awaited the result. That night I stole to my grandmother's house, and Benjamin also stole thither from his master. My grandmother had gone to spend a day or two with an old friend living in the country. "I have come," said Benjamin, "to tell you goodbye. I'm going away." I inquired, "Where?" "To the north," he replied. I looked to him to see whether he was in earnest, and I saw it all in his firm, set mouth. I implored him not to go, but he paid no heed to my words. He said he was no longer a boy, and every day made his yoke more galling. He had raised his hand against his master and was to be publicly whipped for the offense. I reminded him of the poverty and hardship that he must encounter among strangers. I told him he might be caught and brought back. That was terrible to think of. He grew vexed and asked if poverty and hardship with freedom were not preferable to our treatment in slavery. "Linda," he continued, "we are dogs here, footballs, cattle, everything that's mean. No, I will not stay. Let them bring me back. We don't die but once." He was right, and it was hard to give him up. "Go," I said, "and break your mother's heart." I repented my words ere they were out. "Linda," he said, speaking as if he had not heard him speak that evening, "how could you say that? Poor mother. Be kind to her, Linda, and you, too, Cousin Fanny." Cousin Fanny was a friend who had lived some years with us. Farewells were exchanged, and the bright, kind boy, endeared to us by so many acts of love, vanished from our sights. It was not necessary to state how he made his escape. Suffice it to say, he was on his way to New York when a violent storm overtook the vessel. The captain, he said, must be put into the nearest port. This alarmed Benjamin, who was aware he'd be advertised in every port near his own town. His embarrassment was noticed by the captain. To the port they went. There was an advertisement that met the captain's eye. Benjamin so exactly answered the description, the captain laid hold of him and bound him in chains. The storm passed. They proceeded to New York. Before reaching that port, Benjamin managed to get off his chains and throw them overboard. He escaped from the vessel, but was pursued, captured, and carried back to his master. When my grandmother returned home and found that her youngest child had fled, great was her sorrow, but with characteristic piety, she said, "God's will be done." Each morning she inquired if any news had been heard from her boy. Yes, news was heard. The master was rejoicing over a letter announcing the capture of his human chattel. That day seems but as yesterday, but I do remember that I saw him led to the street and chained to the jail. His face was ghastly pale, yet full of determination. He begged one of the sailors to go to his mother's house and ask her not to meet him. He said the sight of her distress would take from him all self-control. She yearned to see him, and she went, but screened herself in the crowd that it might be seen that her child had said. We were not allowed to visit him, but we had known the jailer for years, and he was a kind-hearted man. At midnight, he opened the jail door for my grandmother and myself to enter in disguise. When we entered the cell, not a sound broke, but silence. "Benjamin, Benjamin," whispered my grandmother. No answer. "Benjamin," she again faltered. There was a jingle of chains. The moon had just risen. and cast an uncertain light through the bars of the window. We knelt down and took Benjamin's cold hands in ours. We did not speak. Sobs were heard, and Benjamin's lips were unsealed, for his mother was weeping on his neck. How vividly does memory bring back that sad sight. Mother and son talked together. He asked her pardon for the suffering he had caused her. She said she had nothing to forgive. She could not blame his desire for freedom. He told her that when he was captured, he broke away and was casting himself in the river. And thoughts of her came over him, and he desisted. She asked him if he did not think of God. He said, I fancied I saw his face grow fierce in the moonlight. He answered, no, I didn't think of him. When a man is hunted like a wild beast, he forgets there is a God, a heaven. He forgets everything in his struggle to get beyond the reach of the bloodhounds. Don't talk so, Benjamin, said she. Put your trust in God. Be humble, my child. Your master will forgive you. Forgive me for what, mother? For not letting him treat me like a dog? No, I will never humble myself to him. I've worked for him for nothing all my life, and I'm repaid with stripes and imprisonment, and here I'll stay until I die or till he sells me. The mother shuddered at his words. I think that he felt it, for when he next spoke, his voice was calmer. Don't fret about me, mother. I ain't worth it, he said. I wish I'd had some of your goodness. You bear everything patiently, just as though you had thought it all right. I wish I could. She told him she had not always been so. She was like him. But when sore troubles came upon her, she learned there was no arm to lean upon. She learned to call upon God, and he lightened her burdens. She besought him to do likewise. We overstayed our time. We were obliged to hurry from the jail. Benjamin had been in prison 3 weeks. When my grandmother went to intercede for him with his master, he was unmovable. He said Benjamin should serve as an example to the rest of the slaves. He'd be kept in jail until he's subdued, or he would be sold. But $1 for him. However, afterwards he relented in some degree. The chains were taken off. We were allowed to visit him. As his food was the coarsest of kind, we carried him as often as possible a warm supper, accompanied by some little luxury for the jailer. 3 months elapsed, and there was no prospect of release for a purchaser. One day he was heard to sing and laugh. The piece of indecorum, he was told to his master. The overseer ordered to rechain him. Now he was confined in an apartment with other prisoners who were covered in filthy rags. Benjamin was chained near them and was soon covered with vermin. He worked his chains until he succeeded getting out of them. He passed through the bars of the window with a request that he should be taken to his master. He should be covered with vermin. The audacity was punished with heavier chains and a prohibition of our visits. My grandmother continued to send him fresh changes of clothes, and the old ones were burnt up. The last night we saw him in jail, his mother still begged him to send for his master to beg his pardon. Neither persuasion nor arguments could turn him from his purpose. He calmly answered, I am waiting his time. Those chains were mournful to hear. 3 months had passed. Benjamin left his prison walls. We that loved him waited to bid him a long and last farewell. A slave trader bought him. You remember I told you what price he bought when 10 years of age. Now he was more than 20 years old and was sold for $300. The master had been so blind to his own interests. Long confinement had made his face too pale, form too thin. Moreover, the trader heard something of his character and did not strike him as suitable for a slave. He said he would give any price if the handsome lad was a girl. We thank God he was not. Could you have seen the mother clinging to her child when they fastened irons upon his wrists? Could you have heard her heart-rending groans, seen her bloodshot eyes wander fiercely, face to face, vainly pleading for mercy? Could you have witnessed that scene as I saw it? Would you exclaim slavery is damnable? Benjamin, her youngest, her pet, was forever gone. She could not realize it. She had an interview with the trader for the purpose of ascertaining if Benjamin could be purchased. She was told it was impossible, for he had been given bond, nor to sell him until he was out of state. He promised that he would not sell him until he reached New Orleans. With a strong arm and unvaried
trust. My grandmother began her work of love. Benjamin must be free. If she succeeded, she knew that they would still be separated, but the sacrifice was not too great. Day and night she labored. The trader's price would treble that he gave, but that could not discourage. She employed a lawyer to write a gentleman whom she knew in New Orleans and begged him in interest of himself for Benjamin, and he willingly favored her request. When he saw Benjamin, he stated his business and thanked him, but he said he preferred to wait a while before making the trader an offer. He knew that he had to try to obtain a high price for him and had invariably failed, to encourage him to make another effort for his freedom. So one morning, long before day, Benjamin was missing. He was riding over blue billows, bound for Baltimore. For once his white face did him kindly service. They had no suspicion that he belonged to a slave. Otherwise, law would have been followed him out to the letter, the thing that rendered back to slavery. The brightest skies are often overshadowed by the darkest cloud. Benjamin was taken sick, compelled to remain in Baltimore for 3 weeks. His strength was slow in returning. His desire to continue his journey seemed to retard his recovery. How could he get strength without air and exercise? He resolved to venture on short walk, a by-street selected, where he thought himself secure to not be met by anyone that knew him. But a voice cried out, "Hello, Ben, my boy, what are you doing here?" His first impulse was to run, but his legs trembled so that he could not stir. He turned around to confront his antagonist, and behold, there stood his old master's next-door neighbor. He thought it was all over with him, but it proved otherwise. That man was a miracle. He possessed a goodly number of slaves, and yet was not quite deaf to the mystic clock ticking that rarely heard by a slave master's breast. "Ben, you are sick. Why do you look like a ghost?" "I gave you something of a start." "Never mind, Ben. I'm not going to touch you. You had a pretty tough time of it. You may go on your way rejoicing for all of me, but I would advise you to get out of this place pretty damn quick, for there's several gentlemen here from our town." He described the nearest safest route to New York and added, "I shall be glad to tell your mother I've seen you. Goodbye, Ben." Benjamin turned away, filled with gratitude and surprise at the town he hated. Such a gem worthy of a pure setting. This gentleman was a northerner by birth, and he had married a southern lady. On his return, he told my grandmother he had seen her son and the service he had rendered him. Benjamin reached New York safely and concluded to stop there until he had gained strength enough to proceed further. It happened that my grandmother's only remaining son had sailed for the same city on business for his mistress. Through God's providence, the brothers met. You may be sure it was a happy meeting. "Oh, Phil," exclaimed Benjamin, "I'm here at last." And he told him how he had came to dine almost in sight of free land, and how he had prayed that he might live to get one breath of free air. He said life was worth something now, and it would be hard to die. The old jail, he had not valued it, but once he was tempted to destroy it, but something, he did not know what, prevented him. Perhaps it was fear. He had heard of those that profess to be religious declare there is no heaven for self-murderers. As his life had been pretty hot here, he did not desire continuation of the same in another world. "If I die now," he exclaimed, "thank God, I shall die a freeman." He begged my Uncle Philip not to return to the South, but to stay and work with him till they earned enough money to buy those at home. His brother told him it would kill Mother if he deserted her in trouble. She had pledged her house, with difficulty raised money to buy him. Would he be bought? "No, never," he replied. "Do you suppose, Phil, when I got that far out of their clutches, I would give them 1 red cent? No, do you suppose that I would turn Mother out of her home in her old age, that I would let her pay those hard-earned dollars for me and never see me?
For you know she will stay south as long as her children are slaves. What a good mother. Tell her if to buy you, Phil. You have been a comfort to her. I have been trouble. Linda, poor Linda. What will become of her, Phil? You don't know what life they lead here. She has told me everything about it, and I wish old Flint was dead, or a better man. When I was in jail, he asked if she didn't want him to ask my master to forgive me, to take me home again. She told me no, I didn't want to go back. He got mad and said we were all alike. I never despised my own master half as much as I do that man. There are many a worse slaveholder than my master, but for all that I would not be his slave. While Benjamin was sick, he had parted with nearly all of his clothes to pay necessary expenses, but he did not part with a little pin I fastened to his bosom when we parted. It was the most valuable thing I owned. I thought none more worthy to wear it. He had it still. His brother furnished him with clothes and gave him what money he had. They parted with moistened eyes, and Benjamin turned away and said, Phil, I part with all my kindred, and it so proved we never heard of him again. Until Philip came home. The first words he uttered when he entered the house is, Mother, Ben is free. I've seen him in New York. She stood looking at him with a bewildered air. Mother, don't you believe it? He said, laying his hand softly upon his shoulder. She raised her hands and exclaimed, God be praised, let us thank him. She dropped on her knees and poured forth her heart in prayer. Then Philip must sit down and repeat every word Benjamin had said. He told her all. He only forbore to mention how sick and pale her darling looked. Why should he distress her when she could do him no good? The brave woman still toiled on, hoping to rescue some of her children. After a while, and succeeding in buying Philip, she paid $800 to come home with the precious document that secured his freedom. The happy mother and son sat together in the old hearthstone that night, telling how proud they were of each other and how they proved to the world that they could take care of themselves as they had taken care of others. We concluded by saying, he is willing to be a slave, let him be a slave. I love this one. This one's going to be hot. Okay, we're going to do 2 more chapters, and then I think I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop right here, but I love the... Uh-oh, it's about to get nasty, y'all. It's going down. Y'all want me to read some more? I can stop. I can pick back up. I just wanted to get this started. You guys done? Because I can go to sleep and pick this back up in a couple of hours. What y'all say? Are y'all live? There are 9 here, 8 here. Oh, the crowd is too small. We should stop. It's 2:03. Let me come back in a couple of hours. If people are interested, I'm going to continue this. But I'm going to start in chapter 5. Let me see how much this book is.